Speaking of poaching Morghez's lover, called the third age by some, an age yet to come, an age long past, a wind rose in the great forest called Brame Wood. The wind was not the beginning. There are neither beginnings nor endings to the turning of the wheel of time, but it was a beginning. South and west it blew, dry, beneath a sun of molten gold. There had been no rain for long weeks in the land below, and the late summer heat grew day by day. Brown leaves come early, dotted some trees, and naked stones baked where small streams had run. In an open place where grass had vanished and only thin withered brush held the soil with its roots, the wind began uncovering long-buried stones. They were weathered and worn, and no human eye would have recognized them for the remains of a city remembered in story, yet otherwise forgotten. Scattered villages appeared before the wind crossed the border of Andor, and fields where worried farmers trudged arid furrows. The forest had long since thinned to thickets by the time the wind swept dust down the lone street of a village called Core Springs. The springs were beginning to run low this summer. A few dogs lay panting in the swelter, and two shirtless boys ran, beating a stuffed bladder along the ground with sticks. Nothing else stirred, save the wind and the dust and the creaking sign above the door of the inn, red brick and thatch roofed like every other building along the street. At 2 stories, it was the tallest and largest structure in Core Springs, a neat and orderly little town. The saddled horses hitched in front of the inn barely twitched their tails. The inn's carved sign proclaimed, "The Good Queen's Justice." Blinking against the dusk, Min kept an eye pressed to the crack in the shed's rough wall. She could just make out one shoulder of the guard on the shed door, but her attention was all for the inn further on. She wished the name were less ominously apt. Their judge, the local lord, had apparently arrived some time ago, but she had missed seeing him. No doubt he was hearing the farmers' charges. Admer Nem, along with his brothers and cousins and all their wives, had seemed in favor of an immediate hanging before one of the lord's retainers happened by. She wondered what the penalty was here for burning up a man's barn, and his milk cows with it. By accident, of course, but she did not think that would count for where you can be under someone's eyes every minute. Wages are lower in the Chalinda. That means sweet girl. Or maybe... Suddenly the cart gave a harder lurch than any before, then picked up speed as if the horse were reaching for a gallop. Bumping around like grain on a chaffing sieve, the 3 women stared at one another in surprise. Then Swan levered herself up and pulled aside the canvas hiding the driver's seat. Joni was gone. Throwing herself across the wooden seat, Swan grabbed the reins and reared back, hauling the horse to a halt. Min threw open the back curtains, searching. The road ran through a thicket here, nearly a small forest of oak and elm, pine and leatherleaf. The dust of their short dash was still settling, some of it on Joni, where he lay sprawled by the side of the hard-packed dirt road, 60 or so paces back. Instinctively, Min leaped down and ran back to kneel beside the big man. He was still breathing, but his eyes were closed, and a bloody gash on the side of his head was coming up in a purple lump. Liana pushed her aside and felt Joni's head with sure fingers. "He will live," she said crisply. "Nothing seems broken, but he will have a headache for days after he wakes." Sitting back on her heels, she folded her hands, and her voice saddened. "There is nothing I can do for him in any case. Burn me. I promised myself I would not cry over it again." The question... Min swallowed and started again. "The question is, do we load him in the back of the cart and take him on to the manor, or do we go? Light, I'm no better than Swan." "We could carry him as far as the next farm," Liana said slowly. Swan came up to them, leading the cart horse as if afraid the placid animal might bite. One glance at the man on the ground, and she frowned. "I never had that falling off the cart. I don't see root or rock here to cause it." She started studying the wood around them, and a man rode out of the trees on a tall black stallion, leading 3 mares, one shaggy and 2 hands shorter than the others. He was a tall man in a blue silk coat, with a sword at his side, his hair curling to broad shoulders, darkly handsome, despite a hardening, as though misfortune had marked him deeply. And he was the last man men expected to see. "Is this your work?" Swan demanded of him. Logain smiled as he reined in beside the cart, though there was little amusement in it. "A sling is a useful thing, Mara. You are lucky I am here. I didn't expect you to leave the village for some hours yet, and barely able to walk then. The local lord was indulgent, it seems." Abruptly his face went even darker, and his voice was rough stone. "Did you think I would leave you to your fate? Maybe I should have. You made promises to me, Mara. I want the revenge you promised. I've followed you halfway to the Sea of Storms on this search, though you won't tell me what for. I've asked no questions as to how you plan to give me what you promised, but I will tell you this now. Your time is growing short. End your search soon and deliver your promises, or I will leave you to find your own way. You'll quickly find most villages offer small sympathy to penniless strangers. 3 pretty women alone? The sight of this," he touched the sword at his hip, "has kept you safe more times than you can know. Find what you are seeking soon, Mara." He had not been so arrogant at the beginning of their journey. Then he had been humbly thankful for their help. As humbly as a man like Logain could manage, anyway. It seemed that time, and the lack of results, had withered his gratitude. Swan did not flinch away from his stare. "I hope to," she said firmly. "But if you want to go, then leave our horses and go. If you won't row, get out of the boat and swim by yourself. See how far you get with your revenge alone." Logain's big hands tightened on his reins until men heard his knuckles crack. He shivered with emotions in strong check. "I will stay a while longer, Mara," he said finally. "A little while longer." For an instant, to men's eyes, a halo flared around his head, a radiant crown of gold and blue. Swan and Liana saw nothing, of course, though they knew what she could do. Sometimes she saw things about people. Viewings, she called them, images or auras. Sometimes she knew what they meant. That woman would marry. That man would die. Small matters or grand events, joyous or bleak. There was never any rhyme or reason to who or where or when. Aes Sedai and warders always had auras. Most people never did. It was not always pleasant, knowing. She had seen Logain's halo before, and she knew what it meant. Glory to come. But for him, perhaps above all men, surely that made no sense at all. His horse and his sword and his coat had come from playing at dice, though Min was not certain how fair the games had been. He had nothing else, and no prospects except Swan's promises, and how could Swan ever keep them? His very name was likely a death sentence. It just made no sense. Logain's humor returned as suddenly as it had gone. Pulling a fat, roughly woven purse from his belt, he jangled it at them. "I've come by a few coins. We won't have to sleep in another barn for a while." "We heard of it," Swan said dryly. "I suppose I should have expected no better from you. Think of it as a contribution to your search." She stretched out her hand, but he tied the purse back to his belt with a faintly mocking grin. "I would not want to taint your hand with stolen coin, Mara. Besides, this way, perhaps I can be sure you won't run off and leave me." Swan looked as if she could have bitten a nail in two, but she said nothing. Standing in his stirrups, Logain peered down the road toward Core Springs. "I see a flock of sheep coming this way and a pair of boys. Time for us to ride. They'll carry word of this as fast as they can run." Settling back down, he glanced at Joni, still lying there unconscious. "And they'll fetch help for that fellow. I don't think I hit him hard enough to hurt him badly." Min shook her head. The man continually surprised her. She would not have thought he would spare a second thought for a man whose head he had just cracked. Swan and Liana wasted no time scrambling into their high-cantled saddles, Liana onto the gray mare she called Moonflower, Swan onto Bella, the short, shaggy mare. It was more of a scramble for Swan. She was no horsewoman. After weeks in the saddle, she still treated sedate Bella like a fiery-eyed warhorse. Liana handled Moonflower with effortless ease. Men knew she was somewhere in between. She climbed onto Wild Rose, her bay, with considerably more grace than Swan, considerably less than Liana. "Do you think he will come after us?" Min asked as they started south, away from Core Springs, at a trot. She meant the question for Swan, but it was Logain who answered. "The local lord? I doubt he thinks you important enough. Of course he may send a man, and he'll certainly spread your descriptions. We will ride as far as we can manage before stopping, and again tomorrow." It seemed he was taking charge. "We aren't important enough," Swan said, bouncing awkwardly in her saddle. She might have been wary of Bella, but the look she directed at Logain's back said his challenge to her authority would not last long. For herself, Min hoped Bryn considered them unimportant. He probably did, as long as he never learned their real names. Logain quickened the stallion's pace, and she heeled Wild Rose to keep up, putting her thoughts ahead, not behind.
Tucking his leather gauntlets behind his sword belt, Gareth Bryn picked up the curl-brimmed velvet hat from his writing table. The hat was the latest fashion from Camelin. Carlin had seen to that. He had no care for fashion, but she thought he should dress suitably for his position, and it was the silks and velvets she laid out for him in the mornings. As he set the high-crowned hat on his head, he caught sight of his shadowy reflection in one of the study windows. Fitting that it was so wavery and thin. Squint as much as he would, his gray hat and gray silk coat, embroidered with silver scrolls down the sleeves and collar, looked nothing like the helmet and armor he was used to. That was over and done. And this was something to fill empty hours, that was all. "Are you certain you want to do this, Lord Gareth?" He turned from the window to where Carlin stood beside her own writing table, across the room from his. Hers was piled with the estate account books. She had run his estates all the years he had been gone, and without doubt she still made a better job of it than he did. "If you had set them to work for Admir Nem, as the law required," she went on, "this would be none of your affair at all." "But I did not," he told her, "and would not if I had it to do again. You know as well as I do, Nem and his male kin would be trying to corner those girls day and night. And Megan, and the rest of the women, would make their lives the pit of doom. That is, if all three girls didn't accidentally fall down a well and drown." "Even Megan would not use a well," Carlin said dryly, "not with the weather we've been having. Still, I take your point, Lord Gareth. But they must have had most of a day and a night to run in any direction. You will locate them as soon by sending out word of them, if they can be found." "Thad can find them." Thad was over 70, but he could still track yesterday's wind across stone by moonlight, and he had been more than happy to turn the brickyard over to his son. "If you say so, Lord Gareth." She and Thad did not get on. "Well, when you bring them back, I can certainly use them in the house." Something in her voice, casual as it was, pricked his attention. A touch of satisfaction. Practically from the day he arrived home, Carlin had introduced a succession of pretty maids and farm girls into the manor house, all willing and eager to help the lord forget his miseries. "They are oath breakers, Carlin. I fear it's the fields for them." A brief, exasperated tightening of her lips confirmed his suspicions, but she kept her tone indifferent. "The other two, perhaps, Lord Gareth, but the Domani girl's grace would be wasted in the fields, and would suit serving at table very well. A remarkably pretty young woman. Still, it will be as you wish, of course." So that was the one Carlin had picked out. A remarkably pretty young woman indeed, though oddly different from the Domani women he had met. A touch hesitant here, a touch too fast there. almost as if she were just now trying out her arts for the first time. That was impossible, of course. Domani women trained their daughters to twine men around their fingers almost from the cradle. Not that she had been ineffective, he admitted. If Carlin had sprung her on him among the farm girls, remarkably pretty. So why was it not her face that kept filling his mind? Why did he find himself thinking of a pair of blue eyes, challenging him as though wishing she had a sword, afraid and refusing to yield to fear? Mara Tomanis. He had been sure she was one to keep her word, even without oaths. I will bring her back, he muttered to himself. I will know why she broke oath. As you say, my lord, Caroline said. I thought she might do for your bedchamber maid. Selah is getting a bit old to be running up and down the stairs to fetch for you at night. Bryn blinked at her. What? Oh, the demonic girl. He shook his head at Caroline's foolishness. But was he being any less foolish? He was the lord here. He should remain here to take care of his people. Yet Carlin had taken better care than he knew how, all the years he was gone. He knew camps and soldiers and campaigns, and maybe a bit of how to maneuver in court intrigues. She was right. He should take off his sword and this fool hat, and have Carlin write out their descriptions, and... Instead, he said, keep a close eye on Admiral Nem and his kin. They'll try to cheat you as much as they can. As you say, my lord. The words were perfectly respectful. The tone told him to go teach his grandfather to shear sheep. Chuckling to himself, he went outside. The manor house was really little more than a tremendously overgrown farmhouse. 2 rambling stories of brick and stone under a slate roof, added to again and again by generations of Bryns. House Bryn had owned this land, or it had owned them, since Andor was wrought from the wreckage of Arthur Hawkwing's empire 1,000 years before. And for all that time, it had sent its sons off to fight Andor's wars. He would fight no more wars, but it was too late for House Bryn. There had been too many years, too many battles. He was the last of the blood. No wife, no son, no daughter. The line ended with him. All things had to end. The wheel of time turned. 20 men waited beside saddled horses on the stone-paved yard in front of the manor house. Men even grayer than he, mostly, if they had hair. Experienced soldiers all, former squadmen, squadron leaders, and bannermen who had served with him at one time or another in his career. Johnny Chagrin, who had been senior bannerman of the Guards, was right at the front with a bandage around his temples, though Bryn knew for a fact his daughters had set their children to keep him in his bed. He was one of the few who had any family, here or anywhere else. Most had chosen to come serve Gareth Bryn again, rather than drink away their pensions over reminiscences no one but another old soldier wanted to hear. All wore swords belted over their coats, and a few carried long steel-tipped lances that hung for years on a wall until this very morning. Every saddle had a fat blanket roll behind and bulging saddlebags, plus a pot or kettle and full water bags, just as if they were riding out on campaign instead of a week's jaunt to chase down 3 women who set fire to a barn. Here was a chance to relive old days, or pretend to. He wondered if that was what was rousting him out. He was certainly too old to go riding off after a set of pretty eyes and a woman young enough to be his daughter, maybe his granddaughter. I am not that big a fool, he told himself firmly. Carlin could manage things better with him not getting in the way. A lanky bay gelding came galloping up the oak lane that led down to the road, and the rider threw himself out of the saddle before the animal came to a full stop. The man half stumbled, but still managed to put fist to heart in a proper salute. Barim Halla, who served under him as a senior squadman years ago, was hard and wiry, with a leather egg for a head and white eyebrows that seemed to be trying to make up for the lack of other hair. "You've been recalled to Camelin, my Captain General?" he panted. "No," Bryn said, too sharply. What do you mean riding in here as though you had carrion and cavalry on your tail? Some of the other horses were frisking, catching the bay's mood. Never rode that hard unless you my lord. Barham's grin faded. He was not laughing. Well, my lord, I seen the horses, and I reckoned. The man took another look at his face and cut off that line. Well, actually, I got some news, too. I've been over to New Braham to see my sister, and I heard plenty. New Braham was older than Andor. Old Braham had been destroyed in the Trolloc Wars 1,000 years before Arthur Hawkwing, and it was a good place for news. A middling-sized border town, well to the east of his estates, on the road from Camelin to Tarvalin. Even with Morghase's current attitude, the merchants would keep that road busy. Well, out with it, man. If there's news, what is it? Just trying to figure where to start, my lord. Barham straightened unconsciously, as though making a report. Most important, I reckon. They say Tyr has fallen. Ailman took the stone itself, and the sword that cannot be touched has flat been touched. Somebody drew it, they say. And Aiel drew it, Bryn said incredulously. And Aiel would die before he touched a sword. He had seen it happen in the Aiel War. Though it was said Kalandor was not really a sword at all, whatever that meant. I didn't say, my lord. I heard names. Ren somebody or other most often. But they was talking it like fact, not rumor. Like everybody knew. Bryn's forehead creased in a frown. Worse than troubling, if true. If Kalandor had been drawn, then the dragon was reborn. According to the prophecies, that meant the last battle was coming, a dark one breaking free. The dragon reborn would save the world, so the prophecies said, and destroy it. This was news enough by itself to have set Hala galloping, if he had thought twice. But the leathery fellow was not finished. Word come down from Tarvalin is near as big, my lord. They say there's a new Amerlin seat. Elida, my lord, who was the queen's advisor. Blinking suddenly, Hala hurried on. Morghaze was forbidden ground, and every man on the estate knew it, though Bryn had never said so. They say the old Amerlin, Swan Sanche, was stilled and executed, and Logain died too. That false dragon they caught and gentled last year. They talked it like it was true, my lord. Some of them claimed they was in Tarvalin when it all happened. Logain was no great news, even if he had started a war in Gillidan by claiming to be the Dragon Reborn. There had been several false dragons the last few years. He could channel, though. That was a fact. Until the Aes Sedai gentled him. Well, he was not the first man to be caught and gentled, cut off from the power, so he could never channel again. They said men like that, whether false dragons or just poor fools the Red Ajah took against, never lived long. It was said they gave up wanting to live. Swan Sanche, though, that was news. He had met her once, nearly 3 years ago. A woman who demanded obedience and gave no reasons. Tough as an old boot, with a tongue like a file and a temper like that of a bear with a sore tooth. He would have expected her to tear any upstart claimant limb from limb with her bare hands. Stilling was the same as gentling for a man, but more rare by far, especially for an Amerlin seat. Only 2 Amerlins in 3,000 years had suffered that fate, so far as the tower admitted, though it was possible they could have hidden 24 more. The tower was very good at hiding what they wanted hidden. But an execution on top of Stilling seemed unnecessary. It was said women survived Stilling no better than men did gentling. It all stank of trouble. Everyone knew the tower had secret alliances, strings tied to thrones, and powerful lords and ladies. With a new Amerlin raised in this fashion, some would surely try to test whether the Aes Sedai still watched as closely. And once this fellow in Tyr quelled any opposition, not that there was likely to be much if he really did have the stone, he would move against Ilion or Cairhien. The question was, how quickly could he move? Would forces be gathered against him or for him? He had to be the true dragon reborn, but the houses would go both ways, and the people too. And if petty squabbles broke out because the tower... "Old fool," he muttered. Seeing Barham give a start, he added, "Not you, another old fool." None of this was his affair any longer, except to decide which way House Bryn went when the time came. Not that anyone would care, except to know whether or not to attack him. Bryn had never been a powerful house, or large. My lord," Barham glanced at the men waiting with their horses. "Do you think you might need me, my lord?" Without even asking where or why. He was not the only one bored with country life. "Catch up to us when you have your gear together. We'll be heading south on the Four Kings Road to start." Barham saluted and dashed away, dragging his horse behind him. Climbing into his saddle, Bryn swung his arm forward without a word, and the men fell into a column of twos behind him as they headed down the oak lane. He meant to have answers. If he had to take this Mara by the scruff of the neck and shake her, he would have answers.
The High Lady Altima relaxed as the gates of the royal palace of Andor swung open and her carriage rolled in. She had not been certain they would open. It had surely taken long enough to get a note taken in, and longer still to have a reply. Her maid, a thin girl acquired here in Camelin, goggled and all but bounced on the seat across from her at the excitement of actually entering the palace. Snapping open her lace fan, Altima tried to cool herself. It was still well short of midday. The heat would grow worse yet. To think she had always thought of Andor as cool. Hastily she reviewed what she meant to say one last time. She was a pretty woman. She knew exactly how pretty, with large brown eyes that made some mistakenly think her innocent, even harmless. She knew she was neither, but it suited her very well to have others believe her so, especially here, today. This carriage had taken almost the last of the gold she had managed to carry away when she fled Tyr. If she was to re-establish herself, she needed powerful friends, and there was none more powerful in Andor than the woman she had come to see. The carriage halted near a fountain in a column-ringed courtyard, and a servant in red and white livery rushed to open the door. Altima barely glanced at the courtyard or the serving man. Her mind was all on the meeting ahead. Black hair spilled to the middle of her back from beneath a close-fitting cap of seed pearls, and more pearls lined the tiny pleats of her high-necked gown of watery green silk. She had met Morghese once, briefly, 5 years ago during a state visit, a woman who radiated power, as reserved and stately as one should expect of a queen, and also proper in the Andoran way, which meant prim. The rumors in the city that she had a lover, a man not much liked, it seemed, did not fit that very well, of course. But from what Altima remembered, the formality of the gown and the high neck should please Morghese. As soon as Altima's slippers were firmly on the paving stones, the maid, Kara, leaped down and began fussing over the fall of the pleats, until Altima snapped her fan shut and slapped the girl's wrist with it. A courtyard was no place for that. Kara, such a foolish name, flinched back, clutching her wrist with a wounded look and the beginnings of tears. Altima compressed her lips in irritation. The girl did not even know how to take mild reproof. She had been fooling herself. The girl would not do. She was too obviously untrained. But a lady had to have a maid, especially if she was to differentiate herself from the mass of refugees in Andor. She had seen men and women laboring in the sun, even begging in the streets, while wearing the remnants of Kyrian and noble's garb. She thought she had recognized one or two. Perhaps she should take one of them in service. Who could know the duties of a lady's maid better than a lady? And if they were reduced to working with their hands, they should leap at the chance. It might be amusing to have a former friend for a maid. Too late for today, though. And an untrained maid, a local girl, said a little too clearly that Altima was at the edge of her resources, only one step removed from those beggars herself. She put on a look of concerned gentleness. Did I hurt you, Kara? She said sweetly. Remain here in the carriage and soothe your wrist. I'm certain someone will bring you cool water to drink. The mindless gratitude on the girl's face was stupefying. The liveried men, well trained, stood looking at nothing at all. Still, word of Altima's kindness would spread if she knew anything about servants. A tall young man appeared before her in the white-collared red coat and burnished breastplate of the Queen's Guard, bowing with a hand to his sword hilt. I am Guardsman Lieutenant Talanvor, High Lady. If you will come with me, I will escort you to Queen Morghese. He offered an arm, which she took, but otherwise she was scarcely aware of him. She had no interest in soldiers, unless generals and lords. As he attended her down broad corridors, seemingly full of scurrying men and women in livery, they took care not to impede her way, of course. She subtly examined the fine wall hangings, the ivory inlaid chests and high chests, the bowls and vases of chased gold or silver, or thin sea-folk porcelain. The royal palace did not display as much wealth as the Stone of Tyr, but Andor was still a wealthy land, perhaps even as wealthy as Tyr. An older lord would do nicely, malleable for a woman still young, perhaps a touch feeble and infirm. With vast estates, that would be a beginning, while she found out exactly where the strings of power lay in Andor. A few words exchanged with Morghese some years ago were not much of an introduction, but she had that which a powerful queen must want and need: information. Finally, Talanvor ushered her into a large sitting room with a high ceiling painted in birds and clouds and open sky, where ornately carved and gilded chairs stood before a polished white marble fireplace. A part of Altima's mind noted with amusement that the wide red and gold carpet was Tyran work. The young man went to one knee. My queen, he said in a suddenly rough voice, as you have commanded, I bring you the High Lady Altima of Tyr. Morghese waved him away. You are welcome, Altima. It is good to see you again. Sit, and we will talk. Altima managed a curtsy and murmured thanks before taking a chair. Envy curdled inside her. She had remembered Morghese as a beautiful woman, but the golden-haired reality told her how pale that memory had grown. Morghese was a rose in full bloom, ready to overshadow every other flower. Altima did not blame the young soldier for stumbling on his way out. She was just glad he was gone, so she would not have to be aware of him looking at the two of them, comparing. Yet there were changes, too. Vast changes. Morghese, by the grace of the light, Queen of Andor, defender of the realm, protector of the people, high seat of House Trakand, so very reserved and stately and proper, wore a gown of shimmering white silk that showed enough bosom to shock a tavern maid in the mall. It clung to hip and thigh close enough to suit a Tarabon or jade. The rumors were clearly true. Morghese had a lover, and for her to have altered so much, it was equally clear that she tried to please this Gabriel, not make him please her. Morghese still radiated power and a presence that filled the room, but that dress transformed both to something less. Altima was doubly glad she had worn a high neck. A woman that deep in a man's thrall could lash out in a jealous rage on the smallest provocation, or none at all. If she met Gabriel, she would present him as mere indifference as civility would allow. Even being suspected of thinking of poaching Morghese's lover could get her a hangman's noose instead of a rich husband on his last legs. She herself would have done the same. A woman in red and white livery brought wine, an excellent Morandian, and poured it into crystal goblets deeply engraved with the rearing line of Andor. As Morghese took a goblet, she noticed her ring, a golden serpent eating its own tail. The great serpent ring was worn by some women who had trained in the White Tower, as Morghese had, without becoming Aes Sedai, as well as by Aes Sedai themselves. It was a 1,000-year tradition for the queens of Andor to be tower-trained, but rumors were on every lip of a break between Morghese and Tar Valon, and the anti-Aes Sedai sentiment in the streets could have been quashed quickly had Morghese wanted to. Why was she still wearing the ring? Altima would be careful of her words until she knew the answer. The liveried woman withdrew to the far end of the room, out of earshot but close enough to see when the wine needed replenishing. Taking a sip, Morghese said, "It is long since we met. Is your husband well? Is he in Camelin with you?" Hastily, Altima shuffled her plans. She had not thought Morghese knew she had a husband, but she had always been able to think on the run. "Tidosian was well when I last saw him. The light sent he died soon. As well to get on with it. He was of some question about serving this Randall Thor, and that is a dangerous chasm to straddle. Why, lords have been hung as if they were common criminals." "Randall Thor," Morghese mused softly. "I met him once. He did not look like one who would name himself the Dragon Reborn. A frightened shepherd boy, trying not to show it. Yet, thinking back, he seemed to be looking for some escape." Her blue eyes looked inward. "Elida warned me of him." She seemed unaware of having spoken those last words. "Elida was your advisor, then?" Altima said cautiously. She knew it was so, and it made the rumors of a break all the more difficult to believe. She had to know if it was true. "You have replaced her, now that she is Amerlin?" Morghese's eyes snapped back into focus. "I have not." The next instant, her voice softened again. "My daughter Elaine is training in the tower. She has already been raised to the Accepted." Altima fluttered her fan, hoping sweat was not breaking out on her forehead. If Morghese did not know her own feelings toward the tower, there was no way to speak safely. Her plans teetered on the edge of a precipice. Then Morghese rescued them and her. "You say your husband was of two minds about Randall Thor, and you?" She nearly sighed with relief. Morghese might be behaving like an untutored farm girl over this Gabriel, but she still had her sense when it came to power and possible dangers to her realm. "I observed him closely, of course, in the stone. That should plant the seed, if it needed planting. He can channel, and a man who can channel is always to be feared. Yet he is the Dragon Reborn, there is no doubt. The stone fell, and Kalendor was in his hand when it did. The prophecies... I fear I must leave decisions of what to do about the Dragon Reborn to those who are wiser than I. I only know that I am afraid to remain where he rules. Even a High Lady of Tyr cannot match the courage of the Queen of Andor." The golden-haired woman gave her a shrewd look that made her afraid she had overdone the flattery. Some did not like it too open. But Morghese merely leaned back in her chair and sipped her wine. "Tell me about him. This man who is supposed to save us, and destroy us doing it. Success, or at least the beginnings of it. He is a dangerous man beyond any question of the power. A lion seems lazy, half asleep, until suddenly he charges. Then he is all speed and power. Randall Thor seems innocent, not lazy, and naive, not asleep. But when he charges, he has no proper respect for person or position at all. I did not exaggerate when I said he has hanged lords. He is a breeder of anarchy. In Tyr, under his new laws, even a high lord or lady can be called before a magistrate to be fined, or worse, on the charges of the meanest peasant or fisherman. She kept strictly to the truth, as she saw it. She could tell the truth as quickly as a lie when it was necessary. Morghese sipped her wine and listened. Altima might have thought her lounging indolently, except that her eyes showed she was taking in every word and storing it. "You must understand," Altima finished, "that I have only touched the surface. Randall Thor and what he has done in Tyr are subjects for hours." "You will have them," Morghese said, and in her mind Altima smiled. Success. "Is it true," the Queen went on, "that he brought Aiel with him to the stone?" "Oh, yes. Great savages with their faces hidden half the time, and even the women ready to kill as soon as look. They followed him like dogs, terrorizing everyone, and took whatever they wanted from the stone." "I had thought it must be the wildest rumor," Morghese reflected. There have been rumors this past year, but they have not come out of the waste in 20 years, not since the Aiel War. The world certainly does not need this Randall Thor bringing the Aiel down on us again. Her look sharpened again. You said, followed. They have gone? Altima nodded. Just before I left Tyr, and he went with them. With them? Morghese exclaimed. I feared he was in Kyrian right this... You have a guest, Morghese? I should have been told, so I could greet her. A big man strode into the room, tall, his gold-embroidered red silk coat fitting massive shoulders and a deep chest. Altima did not need to see the radiant look on Morghese's face to name him as Lord Gabriel. The assurance with which he had interrupted the Queen did that. He lifted a finger, and the serving woman curtsied and left quickly. He did not ask Morghese's permission to dismiss her servants from her presence either. He was darkly handsome, incredibly so, with wings of white at his temples. Composing her face to commonplace, Altima put on a marginally welcoming smile, suitable for an elderly uncle with neither power, wealth, nor influence. He might be gorgeous, but even if he did not belong to Morghese, he was not a man she would try manipulating unless she absolutely had to. There was perhaps even more of an air of power about him than about Morghese. Gabriel stopped by Morghese and put his hand on her bare shoulder in a very familiar way. She clearly came close to resting her cheek on the back of his hand, but his eyes were on Altima. She was used to men looking at her, but these eyes made her shift uneasily. They were far too penetrating, saw far too much. You come from Tyr? The sound of his deep voice sent a tingle through her. Her skin, even her bones, felt as though she had been dipped in icy water. But oddly, her momentary anxiety melted. It was Morghese who answered. Altima could not seem to find her tongue with him watching her. This is the High Lady Altima, Gabriel. She has been telling me all about the dragon reborn. She was in the Stone of Tyr when it fell. Gabriel, there really were Aiel... The pressure of his hand cut her off. Irritation flashed across her face, but then it was gone, replaced by a smile beaming up at him. His eyes, still on Altima, sent that shiver through her again, and this time she gasped aloud. So much talking must have fatigued you, Morghese, he said without shifting his gaze. You do too much. Go to your bedchamber and sleep. Go now. I will wake you when you have rested enough. Morghese stood immediately, still smiling at him devotedly. Her eyes seemed slightly glazed. Yes, I am tired. I will take a nap now, Gabriel. She glided from the room with never a glance at Altima, but Altima's attention was all on Gabriel. Her heart beat faster. Her breath quickened. He was surely the handsomest man she had ever seen. The grandest, the strongest, the most powerful. Superlatives rolled through her mind like a flood. Gabriel paid no more attention to Morghese's leaving than she did. Taking the chair the Queen had vacated, he leaned back with his boots stretched out in front of him. Tell me why you came to Camelin, Altima. Again the chill ran through her. The absolute truth, but keep it brief. You can give me details later if I want them. She did not hesitate. I tried to poison my husband and had to flee before Tadosian and that trull Estanda could kill me instead, or worse. Randall Thor meant to let them do it as an example. Telling made her cringe. Not because it was a truth she had kept hidden, so much as because she found she wanted to please him more than anything else in the world, and she feared that he might send her away. But he wanted the truth. I chose Camelin because I could not bear Ilion, and though Andor is little better, Kyrian is in near ruins. In Camelin I can find a wealthy husband, or one who thinks he is my protector if need be, and use his power to... He stopped her with a wave of his hand, chuckling. A vicious little cat, though pretty. Perhaps pretty enough to keep, with your teeth and claws drawn. Suddenly his face became more intent. Tell me what you know of Randall Thor, and especially his friends, if he has any, his companions. is allies. She told him, talking until her mouth and throat went dry, and her voice cracked and rasped. She never raised her goblet until he told her to drink. Then she gulped the wine down and spoke on. She could please him. She could please him better than Morghese could think of. The maids working in Morghese's bedchamber dropped hasty curtsies, surprised to see her there in the middle of the morning. Waving them out of the room, she climbed onto her bed, still in her dress. For a time she lay staring at the gilded carvings of the bedposts. No lions of Andor here, but roses, for the rose crown of Andor, but roses suited her better than lions. Stop being stubborn, she chided herself, then wondered why. She had told Gabriel she was tired, or had he told her? Impossible! She was the queen of Andor, and no man told her to do anything. Gareth. Now why had she thought of Gareth Bryn? He had certainly never told her to do anything. The Captain General of the Queen's Guards obeyed the Queen, not the other way around. But he had been stubborn, entirely capable of digging in his heels until she came around to his way. Why am I thinking of him? I wish he were here. That was ridiculous. She had sent him away for opposing her. About what no longer seemed quite clear, but that was not important. He had opposed her. She could remember the feelings she had had for him only dimly, as though he had been gone for years. Surely it had not been so long. Stop being stubborn. Her eyes closed, and she fell immediately into sleep. A sleep troubled by restless dreams of running from something she could not see.
Chapter 2. Rudian. High in the city of Rudian, Rand al'Thor looked out from a tall window. Whatever glass might have once been in it was long since gone. The shadows below slanted sharply east. A bard harp played softly in the room behind him. Sweat evaporated from his face almost as soon as it appeared. His red silk coat, damp between the shoulders, hung open in a fruitless bid for air, and his shirt was unlaced half down his chest. Night in the Aiel waste would bring freezing cold, but during daylight even a breeze was never cool. With his hands above his head on the smooth stone window frame, his coat sleeves fell down to reveal the front part of the figure wrapped around each forearm. A golden-maned serpentine creature with eyes like the sun, scaled in scarlet and gold, each foot tipped with 5 golden claws. Part of his skin they were, not tattoos. They glittered like precious metals and polished gems, seemed almost alive in the late afternoon sun. Those marked him, to the people on this side of the mountain range, variously called the Dragon Wall or the Spine of the World, as he who comes with the dawn. And like the herons branded into his palms, they marked him for those beyond the Dragon Wall too, according to the prophecies, as the Dragon Reborn. In both cases, prophesied to unite, save, and destroy. They were names he would have avoided if he could, but that time was long past, if it had ever existed, and he no longer thought of it, or if he did, on rare occasion, it was with the faint regret of a man recalling a foolish dream of his boyhood, as if he were not close enough to boyhood to remember every minute. Instead, he tried to think only of what he had to do. Fate and duty held him on the path like a rider's reins, but he had often been called stubborn. The end of the road must be reached, but if it could be attained by a different way, maybe it need not be the end. Small chance. No chance, almost certainly. The prophecies demanded his blood. Rudian stretched below him, seared by a sun still pitiless as it sank toward craggy mountains, bleak, with barely a sign of vegetation. This rugged, broken land, where men had killed or died over a pool of water they could step across, was the last place on earth anyone would think to find a great city. Its long-ago builders had never finished their work. Impossibly tall buildings dotted the city, stepped and slab-sided palaces that sometimes ended after 8 or even 10 stories, not with a roof, but with the ragged masonry of another half-built floor. The towers soared higher yet, but stopped in jagged abruptness as often as not. Now a good quarter of the great structures, with their massive columns and immense windows of colored glass, lay strewn as rubble across wide avenues with broad strips of bare dirt down their centers. Dirt that had never held the trees they were planned for. The marvelous fountains stood dry as they had for hundreds upon hundreds of years. All that futile labor, the builders finally dying with their work undone. Yet at times Rand thought that maybe the city had only been begun so he could find it. Too proud, he thought. A man would have to be half mad at least to be so proud. He could not help chuckling dryly. There had been Aes Sedai with the men and women who had come here so long ago. They had known the Koreathon cycle, the prophecies of the dragon. Or perhaps they had written the prophecies. Too proud by tenfold. Directly below him lay a vast plaza, half covered in stretching shadow, littered with a jumble of statues and crystal chairs, oddities and peculiar shapes of metal or glass or stone, things he could put no name to, scattered about in tangled heaps as if deposited by a storm. Even the shadows were cool only by comparison. Rough-clothed men, not Aiel, sweated to load wagons with items chosen by a short, slender woman in pristine blue silk, straight-backed and gliding from place to place, as though the heat did not press down on her as hard as on the others. Still, she wore a damp white cloth tied around her temples. She just did not let herself show the effects of the sun. Rand would have wagered she did not even perspire. The workman's leader was a dark, bulky man named Adnan Kadir, a supposed merchant dressed all in cream-colored silk that was sweat-sodden today. He mopped his face continually with a large handkerchief, shouting curses at the men, his wagon drivers and guards. But he leaped as quickly as they to haul at whatever the slim woman pointed out, big or small. Aes Sedai had no need of size to impose their will, but Rand thought that Moraine would have done as well if she had never been near the White Tower. Two of the men were trying to move what appeared to be an oddly twisted redstone door frame. The corners did not meet properly, and the eye did not want to follow the straight pieces. It stayed upright, turning freely but refusing to tip over, however they manhandled it. Then one slipped and fell through the doorway up to his waist. Rand tensed. For a moment the fellow seemed not to exist above the waist, his legs kicking wildly in panic. Until Lan, a tall man in drab shades of green, strode over and hauled him out again by his belt. Lan was Moraine's warder, bonded to her in some way Rand did not understand, and a hard man who moved like the Aiel, like a hunting wolf. The sword at his hip did not seem part of him, it was part of him. He dropped the workman on the paving stones on the seat of his breeches and left him there. The fellow's terrified cries rose thinly to Rand, and his companion looked ready to run. Several of Kadir's men, who had been close enough to see, were looking at one another and at the mountains around the city, plainly assessing their chances. Moraine appeared among them so quickly it seemed by the power, moving smoothly from man to man. Her manner made Rand almost hear the cool, imperious instructions coming from her lips, so full of certainty that they would be obeyed that not obeying would seem foolish. In short order, she overrode resistance, stamped firmly on objections, chivied them every one back to work. The pair with the door frame were soon dragging and shoving as hard as ever, if with frequent looks at Moraine, when they thought she would not see. In her own way, she was even harder than Lan. As far as Rand knew, all of those things down there were Ungrial, or Sa-Ungrial, or Tir-Ungrial, made before the breaking of the world to magnify the one power, or use it in various ways. Made with the power, certainly, though not even Aes Sedai knew how to construct such things now. He more than suspected the use of the twisted doorframe, a doorway to another world. But for the rest, he had no idea. No one did. That was why Moraine worked so hard, to have as many as she could carted to the tower for study. It was possible that even the tower did not contain as many objects of the power as lay about this square, though supposedly the tower held the largest collection in the world. Even there, the tower only knew the uses of some. What was in the wagons or tossed about on the pavement did not interest Rand. He had already taken what he needed from down there. Had already taken more than he wanted, in some ways. In the center of the plaza, near the burned remains of a great tree 100 feet high, stood a small forest of tall glass columns, each nearly as tall as the tree, and so slender it seemed the first storm wind must bring them all crashing down. Even with an edge of shadow touching them, the columns caught and refracted the sunlight in glitters and sparkles. For countless years, Aiel men had entered that array and returned marked as Rand was, but on only one arm, marked as clan chiefs. They came out marked, or did not come out.
Hey, Scott, how you
Aiel
doing?
women had to come to this city
Hope
as
you're doing well.
on the path toward becoming wise ones. No one else, not and live. A man may go to Rudion once,
Excuse me.
a woman twice. More means death. That was what the wise ones had said, and it had been truth then. Now, anyone could enter Rudion. Hundreds of Aiel walked the streets, and increasing numbers actually dwelled in the buildings. Each day, more of the dirt strips down the streets showed beans or squash or zamai, arduously watered from clay pots hauled from the huge new lake that filled the south end of the valley, the only such body of water in the entire land. Thousands made their camps in the surrounding mountains, even on Cheyendair itself, where before they had come only with ceremony to send a single man or woman at a time into Rudion. Wherever he went, Rand brought change and destruction. He hoped against hope that the change was for the good. It might yet be so. The burned tree mocked him. Aben Desora, the legendary tree of life. The stories never said where it was, and it had been a surprise to find it here. Moraine said it still lived, that it would put out shoots again, but so far he saw only blackened bark and bare branches. With a sigh, he turned from the window into a big room, though not the biggest in Rudion, with tall windows on two sides, its domed ceiling worked in a fanciful mosaic of winged people and animals. Most of the furniture left in the city had long since rotted away, even in the dryness, and much of the little that remained was riddled with beetles and worms. But on the far side of the room stood one high-backed chair, solid, and its gilding largely intact, but mismatched with its table, a wide thing with legs and edges thickly carved in flowers. Someone had polished the wood with beeswax till it shone dully despite its age. The Aiel had found them for him, though they shook their heads at such things. There were few trees in the waste that could have produced wood straight and long enough to make that chair, and none to make the table. That was all the furniture, as he thought of it. A fine silk Ilianer carpet in blue and gold, booty in some long-ago battle covered the middle of the dark red floor tiles. Cushions lay scattered about in bright silks and tasseled. Those were what Aiel used instead of chairs, when they did not merely sit on their heels, as comfortable as he would be in a padded chair. 6 men reclined against cushions on the carpet. 6 clan chiefs, representing the clans that had so far come to follow Rand. Or rather, to follow he who comes with the dawn.
I'll be right back, everyone.
Not always eagerly. He thought Ruark, a broad-shouldered, blue-eyed man with heavy streaks of gray in his dark red hair, might have some friendship for him. But not the rest. Only 6 of the 12. Ignoring the chair, Rand sat down cross-legged, facing the Aiel. Outside of Rudion, the only chairs in the waste were chief's chairs, used only by the chief, and only for 3 reasons. To be acclaimed as clan chief, to accept the submission of an enemy with honor, or to pass judgment. Taking the chair with these men now would imply that he meant to do one of those. They wore the cut and sore, coats and breeches in shades of brown and gray that would fade into the ground, and soft boots that laced to the knee. Even here, meeting with the man they had proclaimed the Ka'akan, the chief of chiefs, each had a heavy-bladed knife at his belt, and the gray-brown shufa wrapped like a wide scarf around his neck. If any man covered his face with the black veil that was part of the shufa, he would be ready to kill. It was not beyond possibility. These men had fought one another in a never-ending cycle of clan raids and battles and feuds. They watched him, waited for him, but Nail's waiting always spoke of a readiness to move, suddenly and violently. Vale, the tallest man Rand had ever seen, and Geron, blade slender and whip quick, lay as far from one another as they could manage and still be on the carpet. There was blood feud between
Hey,
Vale's
Ozark, how you
and
doing,
Geron's
bro?
Sharaf. Oppressed for he who comes with the dawn.
You know what? Since you're
but
here,
not
let's
forgotten.
do a dab.
And perhaps the peace of Rodion still held despite all that had happened. Still, the tranquil sounds of the harp made a sharp contrast with the hard refusal of Vale and Geron to look at one another. 6 sets of eyes, blue or gray or green in sun-dark faces. Aiel could make hawks look tame. "What must I do to bring the rain to me?" he said. "You were sure they would come, Ruark."
Hey, good to see
The
you
chief
too,
of the
Ozark.
God looked at him calmly. His face could have been carved stone for all its expression. "Wait. Only wait. Derek will bring them. Eventually." White-haired Han, lying next to Ruark, twisted his mouth as if about to spit. His leathery face wore a sour look, as usual. "Derek has seen too many men and maidens sit staring for days, then throw down their spears. Throw them down." "And run away," Vale added quietly. "I have seen them myself, among the Goshin, even from my own sect, running. And you, Han, among the Tomanel. We all have. I do not think they know where they are to, only what they are running from." "Cowardly snakes," Geron barked. Gray streaked his light brown hair. There were no young men among them. "Stink adders running away from their own shadow." A slight shift of his blue eyes on the side of the carpet made it clear he meant it for a description of the Goshin, not just those who had thrown down their spears. His face hardening further. The man next to him put a quieting Braun of the Nakai was big enough and strong enough for 2 blacksmiths. But he had a placid nature that seemed odd for an Aiel. "All of us have seen men and maidens run."
It's just Mountain Dew, y'all.
He sounded almost lazy, and his gray eyes looked so. Yet Rand knew otherwise. Even Ruark considered Ruan a deadly fighter and a devious tactician. Luckily, not even Ruark was stronger for Rand than Ruan. But he had come to follow he who comes with the dawn. He did not know Randall Thor. As you have, Geron. You know how it is to face what they do. If you cannot name cowards those who died because they could not face it, and you cannot those who run for the same reason, they should never have learned, Han muttered, kneading his red-tasseled blue cushion like an enemy's throat. It was for those who could enter Rodion and live. He spoke the words to no one in particular, but they had to be for Rand's ears. It was Rand who had revealed to everyone what a man learned amid the glass columns in the plaza. Revealed enough that the chiefs and wise ones could not turn aside when asked the rest. If there was an Aiel in the waste, he did not know the truth now. He had not spoken to anyone in a month. Far from the glorious heritage of battle most believed in, the Aiel had begun as helpless refugees from the breaking of the world. Everyone who survived had been refugees then, of course, but the Aiel had never seen themselves as helpless. Worse, they had been followers of the Way of the Leaf, refusing to do violence even in defense of their lives. Aiel meant dedicated in the old tongue, and it had been to peace that they were dedicated. Those who called themselves Aiel today were the descendants of those who had broken a pledge of untold generations. Only one remnant of that belief remained. An Aiel would die before taking up a sword. They had always believed in the pride of their separateness from those who lived outside the waste. He had heard Aiel say that they had committed some sin to be placed in the desolate waste. Now they knew what it was. The men and women who had built Rudian and died here, those called the Gen Aiel, the clan that was not, on the few occasions they were spoken of, had been the ones who kept faith with the Aes Sedai of the time before the breaking. It was hard to face the knowledge that they had always believed was a lie. It had to be told, Rand said. They had a right to know. A man shouldn't have to live a lie. Their own prophecy said I would break them, and I couldn't have done differently. The past was past and done. He should be worrying about the future. Besides me, some hate me for not being born among them. But they follow. I need them all. What of the Miagoma? Erim, lying between Roark and Han, shook his head. His once bright red hair was half white, but his green eyes were as strong as any younger man's. His big hands, wide and long and hard, said his arms were as strong too. He does not let his feet know which way he will jump until after he has leaped. When Timlin was young as a chief, Jaron said, he tried to unite the clans and failed. It will not sit well with him that at last one has come to succeed where he failed. You right, Roark said. Timlin never believed himself he who comes with the dawn. And Jonwin will bring the Shianda. But they will wait. They must settle matters in their own minds first. They must settle he who comes with the dawn, being a wetlander, Han barked. I mean no offense, Ka'akarn. There was no obsequiousness in his voice. A chief was not a king. He was the chief of chiefs. At best, he was first among equals. The Derain and the Kadara will come eventually as well, I think, Ruan said calmly, and quickly, lest silence should grow to a reason for dancing the spears. First among equals at best. They have lost more than any other clans to the bleakness. That was what the Aiel had taken to calling the long period of staring before someone tried to run away from being Aiel. For the moment, Mandalane and Indirian are concerned with holding their clans together, and both will want to see the dragons on your arms for themselves. That left only one clan to be discussed, the one none of the chiefs wanted to mention. What news of Couladin and the Shido? Rand asked. Silence answered him, broken only by the softly serene sounds of the harp in the background. Each man waiting for another to speak, all coming as close as Aiel could.
Hell yeah.
Showing discomfort.
I was like, you have a good one, bro.
Jaron frowned at his thumbnail.
And thanks for stopping by.
Toyed with one of the silvery tassels on his green cushion. Even Ruark studied the carpet. Graceful, white-robed men and women moved into the hush, pouring worked silver goblets of wine to set beside each man, bringing small silver plates with olives, rare in the Waste, and nut cheese, pale, wrinkled nuts the Aiel called Bekara. The Aiel faces looking out of those pale cowls had downcast eyes and an unfamiliar meekness on their features. Whether captured in battle or on a raid, the Gashain were sworn to serve obediently for 1 year and a day, touching no weapon, doing no violence, At the end,
Hell yeah, love and
returning to their
respect
own
too,
clan
bro.
concept as if nothing had happened. A strange echo of the way of the leaf. Jieto, honor and obligation required it, and breaking Jieto was nearly the worst thing an Aiel could do. Perhaps the worst. It was possible that some of these men and women were serving their own clan chief, but neither would acknowledge it by the blink of an eye so long as the period of Gaishain held, not even for a son or daughter. It struck Rand suddenly that this was the real reason that Samael took what he had revealed so hard. To those, it must seem that their ancestors had sworn Gaishain, not only for themselves, but for all succeeding generations. And those generations, all down to the present day, had broken Jieto by taking up the spear. Had the men in front of him ever worried along those lines? Jieto was very serious business to an Aiel. The Gaishan departed on soft slippered feet, barely making a sound. None of the clan chiefs touched their wine or the food. Is there any hope that Couladin will meet with me? Rand knew there was not. He had stopped sending requests for a meeting once he learned Couladin was having the messengers skinned alive. But it was a way to start the others talking. Han snorted. The only word we have from him is that he means to flay you when next he sees you. Does that sound as if he will talk? Can I break the Shido away from him? They follow him, Ruark said. He is not a chief at all, but they believe he is. Couladin had never entered those glass columns. He might even still believe, as he claimed, that everything Rand had said was a lie. He says that he is the Ka Khan, and they believe that as well. The Shido maidens who came for their society, and that because Fardarai's Mai carried your honor. No one else will. We send scouts to watch them, Ruan said, and the Shido kill them when they can. Couladin builds the makings of half a dozen feuds. But so far, he shows no signs of attacking us here. I have heard that he claims we have defiled Rudian, and that attacking us here would only deepen the desecration. Aram grunted and shifted on his cushion. He means there are enough spears here to kill every Shido twice over and to spare. He put white cheese into his mouth, growling around it. The Shido are ever cowards and thieves. Honorless dogs, Bale and Jaron said together, then stared at one another as though each thought the other had tricked him into something. Honorless or not, Rowan said quietly, Couladin's numbers are growing. Calm as he sounded, he still took a deep drink from his goblet before going on. You all know what I am speaking of. Some of those who run after the bleakness do not throw away their spears. Instead, they join with their societies among the Shido. No Tomanel has ever broken clan, Han barked. Rohan looked past Ruar and Aram at the Tomanel chief and said deliberately, It has happened in every clan. Without waiting for another challenge to his word, he settled back on his cushion. It cannot be called breaking clan. They join their societies, like the Shido maidens who have come to their roof here. There were a few mutters, but no one disputed him this time. The rules governing Aiel warrior societies were complex, and in some ways their members felt as closely bound to society as to clan. For instance, members of the same society would not fight each other, even if their clans were in blood feud. Some men would not marry a woman too closely related to a member of their own society, just as if that made her their own close blood kin. The ways of Fardarai's Mai, the maidens of the spear, Rand did not even want to think about. I need to know what Couladin intends, he told them. Couladin was a bull with a bee in his ear. He might charge in any direction. Rand hesitated. Would it violate honor to send people to join their societies among the Shido? He did not need to describe what he meant any further. To a man, they stiffened where they lay, even Ruark. eyes cold enough to banish the heat from the room. To spy in that manner, Aram twisted his mouth around spy as if the word tasted foul, would be like spying on your own set. No one of honor would do such a thing. Rand refrained from asking whether they might find someone with a slightly less prickly honor. The Aiel's sense of humor was a strange thing, often cruel, but about some matters they had none at all. To change the subject, he asked, "Is there any word from across the Dragon Wall?" He knew the answer. That sort of news spread quickly, even among as many Aiel as were gathered around Rudian. "None worth the telling," the dwarf replied. "With the troubles among the tree killers, few peddlers come into the threefold land." That was the Aiel name for the waste. A punishment for their sin, a testing ground for their courage, an anvil to shape them. Tree killers was what they called Karienin. The dragon banner still flies over the stone of Tyr. Tyrants have moved north into Karien, as you ordered, to distribute food among the tree killers. Nothing more. "You should have let the tree killers starve," Bale muttered, and Geron closed his mouth with a snap. Rand suspected he had been about to say much the same. "Tree killers are fit for nothing except to be killed or sold as animals in Shara," Aram said grimly. Those were two of the things Aiel did to those who came into the waste uninvited. Only gleeman peddlers and tinkers had safe passage, though Aiel avoided the tinkers as if they carried fever. Shara was the name of the lands beyond the waste. Not even the Aiel knew much about them. From the corner of his eye, Rand saw two women standing expectantly just inside the tall arched doorway. Someone had hung strings of colored beads there, red and blue, to replace the missing doors. One of the women was Moraine. For a moment, he considered making them wait. Moraine had that irritatingly commanding look on her face, clearly expecting them to break off everything for her. Only there was really nothing left to discuss, and he could tell from the men's eyes that they did not want to make conversation. Not so soon after speaking of the bleakness and the Shido. Sighing, he stood, and the clan chiefs imitated him. All except Han were as tall as he, or taller. Where Rand had grown up, Han would have been considered of average height or better. Among Aiel, he was accounted short. "You know what must be done. Bring in the rest of the clans and keep an eye on the Shido." He paused a moment, then added, "It will end well. As well for the Aiel as I can manage." "The prophecy said you would break us," Han said sourly. "And you have made a good beginning. But we will follow you. Till shade is gone," he recited. "Till water is gone. Into the shadow with teeth bared, screaming defiance with the last breath, to spit in Sightblinder's eye on the last day." Sightblinder was one of the Aiel names for the Dark One. There was nothing for Rand except to make the proper response. Once he had not known it. "By my honor and the light, my life will be a dagger for Sightblinder's heart." "Until the last day," the Aiel finished. "To Shale Ghul itself." The harper played on pacifically. The chiefs filed out past the two women, eyeing Moraine respectfully. There was nothing of fear in them. Rand wished he could be as sure of himself. Moraine had too many plans for him, too many ways of pulling strings he did not know she had tied to him. The two women came in as soon as the chiefs were gone, Moraine as cool and elegant as ever. A small, pretty woman, with or without those Aes Sedai features he could never put an age to. She had abandoned the damp, cooling cloth for her temples. In its place, a small blue stone hung suspended on her forehead from a fine golden chain in her dark hair. It would not have mattered if she had kept it. Nothing could diminish her queenly carriage. She usually seemed to own a foot more height than she actually had, and her eyes were all confidence and command. The other woman was taller, though still short of his shoulder, and young, not ageless. Egwene, whom he had grown up with. Now, except for her big dark eyes, she could almost have passed as an Aiel woman, and not only for her tanned face and hands. She wore a full Aiel skirt of brown wool and a loose white blouse of a plant fiber called algoda. Algoda was softer than even the finest woven wool. It would do very well for trade, if he ever convinced the Aiel. A gray shawl hung around Egwene's shoulders, and a folded gray scarf made a wide band to hold back the dark hair that fell below her shoulders. Unlike most Aiel women, she wore only one bracelet, ivory carved into a circle of flames, and a single necklace of gold and ivory beads. And one more thing, a great serpent ring on her left hand. Egwene had been studying with some of the Aiel wise ones. Exactly what, Rand did not know, though he more than suspected something to do with dreams. Egwene and the Aiel women were close-mouthed, but she had studied in the White Tower, too. She was one of the accepted on the way to becoming Aes Sedai, and passing herself off here and in Tyr at least as full Aes Sedai already. Sometimes he teased her about that. She did not take his japes very well, though. "The wagons will be ready to leave for Tar Valon soon," Moraine said. Her voice was musical, crystalline. "Send a strong guard," Rand said, "or Kadir may not take them where you want." He turned for the windows again, wanting to look out and think about Kadir. "You've not needed me to hold your hand or give you permission before." Abruptly, something seemed to strike him across the shoulders, for all the world like a thick hickory stick. Only the slight feel of goosebumps on his skin, not likely in this heat, told him that one of the women had channeled. Spinning back to face them, he reached out to Saidin, filled himself with the one power. The power felt like life itself, swelling inside him, as if he were 10 times, 100 times as alive. The Dark One's taint filled him too, death and corruption, like maggots crawling in his mouth. It was a torrent that threatened to sweep him away, a raging flood he had to fight every moment. He was almost used to it now, and at the same time, he would never be used to it. He wanted to hold on to the sweetness of Saidin forever, and he wanted to vomit. And all the while, the deluge tried to scour him to the bone and burn his bones to ash. The taint would drive him mad eventually if the power did not kill him first. It was a race between the two. Madness had been the fate of every man who had channeled since the breaking of the world began, since that day when Luz Theron Telamon, the dragon, and his 100 companions had sealed up the Dark One's prison at Sheol Ghul. The last backblast from that sealing had tainted the male half of the true source, and men who could channel, madmen who could channel, had torn the world apart. He filled himself with the power, and he could not tell which woman had done it. They both looked at him as if butter would not melt in their mouths, each with an eyebrow arched almost identically in slightly amused questioning. Either or both could be embracing the female half of the source right that instant, and he would never know. Of course, a stick across the shoulders was not Moraine's way. She found other means of chastising, more subtly, usually more painful in the end. Yet, even sure that it must have been Egwene, he did nothing. Proof. Thought slid along the outside of the void. He floated within, in emptiness, thought and emotion, even his anger, distant. I will do nothing without proof. I will not be goaded this time. She was not the Egwene he had grown up with. She had become part of the tower since Moraine sent her there. Moraine again. Always Moraine. Sometimes he wished he were rid of Moraine. Only sometimes. He concentrated on her. What do you want of me? His voice sounded flat and cold to his own ears. The power stormed inside him. Egwene had told him that for a woman touching Saidar, the female half of the source, was an embrace. For a man, always, it was a war without mercy. And don't mention wagons again, little sister. I usually find out what you mean to do long after it is done. The Aes Sedai frowned at him, and no wonder. She was surely not used to being addressed so, not by any man, even the Dragon Reborn. He had no idea himself where little sister had come from. Sometimes of late, words seemed to pop into his head. A touch of madness, perhaps. Some nights he lay awake till the small hours, worrying about that. Inside the void, it seemed someone else's worry. "We should speak alone." She gave the harper a cool glance. Jason Natal, as he called himself here, lay half sprawled on cushions against one of the windowless walls, softly playing the harp, perched on his knee, its upper arm carved and gilded to resemble the creatures on Rand's forearms. Dragons, the Aiel called them. Rand had only suspicions where Natal had gotten the thing. He was a dark-haired man who would have been accounted taller than most elsewhere in the Aiel waste, in his middle years. His coat and breeches were dark blue silk, suitable for a royal court, elaborately embroidered with thread of gold on collar and cuffs. Everything buttoned up or laced despite the heat. The fine clothes were at odds with his gleeman's cloak spread out beside him. A perfectly sound cloak, but covered completely with hundreds of patches and nearly as many colors, all sewn so as to flutter at the slightest breeze. It signified a country entertainer, a juggler and tumbler, musician and storyteller who wandered from village to village. Certainly not a man to wear silk. The man had his conceits. He appeared completely immersed in his music. "You can say what you wish in front of Natal," Rand said. "He is Gleeman to the Dragon Reborn, after all." If keeping the matter secret was important enough, she would press it, and he would send Natal away, though he did not like the man to be out of his sight. Egwene sniffed loudly and shifted her shawl on her shoulders. "Your head is swelled up like an overripe melon, Randolph Thor." She said it flatly, as a statement of fact. Anger bubbled outside the void. Not at what she had said. She had been in the habit of trying to take him down a rung, even when they were children, usually whether he deserved it or not. But of late, it seemed to him she had taken to working with Moraine, trying to put him off balance so the Aes Sedai could push him where she wanted. When they were younger, before they learned what he was, he and Egwene had thought they would marry one day. And now she sided with Moraine against him. Face hard, he spoke more roughly than he intended. "Tell me what you want, Moraine. Tell me here and now, or let it wait until I can find time for you. I'm very busy." That was an outright lie. Most of his time was spent practicing the sword with Lan or the spears with Ruark, or learning to fight with hands and feet from both. But if there was any bullying to be done here today, he would do it. Natal could hear anything. Almost anything. So long as Rand knew where he was at all times. Moraine and Egwene both frowned, but the real Aes Sedai at least seemed to see he would not be budged this time. She glanced at Natal, her mouth tightening. The man still seemed deep in his music, then took a thick wad of gray silk from her pouch. Unfolding it, she laid what it had contained on the table, a disc the size of a man's head, half dead black, half purest white, the two colors meeting in a sinuous line to form two joined teardrops. This had been the symbol of Aes Sedai before the breaking, but this disc was more. Only 7 like it had ever been made, the seals in the Dark One's prison. Or rather, each was a focus for one of the seals. Drawing her belt knife, its hilt wrapped in silver wire, Moraine scraped delicately at the edge of the disc, and a tiny flake of solid black fell away. Even encased in the void, Rand gasped. The emptiness itself quivered, and for an instant the power threatened to overwhelm him. Is it a copy? A fake? "I found this in the square below," Moraine said. "It is real, though. The one I brought with me from Tyr is the same." She could have been saying she wanted pea soup for the midday meal. Egwene, on the other hand, clutched her shawl around her as if cold. Rand felt the stirrings of fright himself, oozing across the surface of the void. It was an effort to let go of Saidin, but he forced himself. If he lost concentration, the power could destroy him where he stood. and he wanted all his attention on the matter at hand. Even so, even with the taint, it was a loss. That flake lying on the table was impossible. Those discs were made of quendia, heartstone, and nothing made of quendia could be broken, not even by the one power. Whatever force was used against it only made it stronger. The making of heartstone had been lost in the breaking of the world, but whatever had been made of it during the age of legends still existed. Even the most fragile vase, even if the breaking had sunk it to the bottom of the ocean or buried it beneath a mountain. Of course, 3 of the 7 discs were broken already, but it had taken a good deal more than a night. Come to think of it, though, he did not know how those 3 really had been broken. If no force short of the Creator could break Heartstone, then that should be that. How? He asked, surprised that his voice was still as steady as when the void had surrounded him. I do not know, Moraine replied, just as calm outwardly. But you do see the problem. A fall from the table could break this. If the others, wherever they may be, are like this, 4 men with hammers could break open that hole in the Dark One's prison again. Who can even say how effective one is in this condition? Brand saw. I'm not ready yet. He was not sure he ever would be ready, but he surely was not yet. Egwene looked as though she were staring into her own open grave. Rewrapping the disc, Moraine replaced it in her pouch. Perhaps I will think of a possibility before I carry this to Tar Valon. If we know why, perhaps something can be done about it. He was caught by the image of the Dark One reaching out from Shale Ghul once more, eventually breaking free completely. Fires and darkness covered the world in his mind, flames that consumed and gave no light. Blackness, solid as stone, squeezing the air. With that filling his head, what Moraine had just said took a moment to penetrate. You intend to go yourself. He had thought she meant to stick to him like moss to a rock. Isn't this what you want? Eventually, Moraine replied quietly. Eventually, I will have to leave you, after all. What will be, must be. Rand thought she shivered, but it was so quick it could have been his imagination. And the next instant, she was all composure and self-control once more. You must be ready. The reminder of his doubts came unpleasantly. We should discuss your plans. You cannot sit here much longer. Even if the Forsaken are not planning to come after you, they are out there, spreading their power. Gathering the Aiel will do no good if you find that everything beyond the spine of the world is in their hands. Chuckling, Rand leaned back against the table. So this was just another ploy. If he was anxious about her leaving, perhaps he would be more willing to listen, more amenable to being guided. She could not lie, of course, not right out. One of the vaunted 3 oaths took care of that, to speak no word that was not true. He had learned that it left a barn width of wriggle room. She would leave him alone eventually, after he was dead, no doubt. You want to discuss my plans, he said dryly. Pulling a short-stemmed pipe and a leather tobacco pouch from his coat pocket, he thumbed the bowl full and briefly touched Saidin to channel a flame dancing above the tobacco. Why? They are my plans. Puffing slowly, he waited, ignoring Egwene's glower. The Aes Sedai's face never changed, but her large, dark eyes seemed to blaze. What have you done when you refused to be guided by me? Her voice was as cool as her features, yet the words still seemed to come like whip cracks. Wherever you have gone, you have left death, destruction, and war behind you. Not in Tyr, he said too quickly, and too defensively. He must not let her put him off balance. Determinedly, he took spaced, deliberate puffs at his pipe. No, she agreed, not in Tyr. For once you had a nation behind you, a people, and what did you do with it? Bringing justice to Tyr was commendable. Establishing order in Carrion, feeding the hungry is laudable. Another time I would praise you for it. She herself was Carrienan. But it does not help you toward the day you face Tarmangaiden. A single-minded woman, and cold when it came to anything else, even her own land. But should he not be just as single-minded? What would you have me do? Hunt down the Forsaken one by one? Again he forced himself to draw more slowly on the pipe. It was an effort. Do you even know where they are? Osamael is in Ilion. You know that. But the rest? What if I go after Samael as you wish and find 2 or 3 or 4 of them? Or all 9? You could have faced 3 or 4, perhaps all 9 surviving, she said icily, had you not left Kalendor in Tyr. The truth is you are running. You do not really have a plan, not a plan to ready you for the last battle. You run from place to place, hoping that in some way everything will come out for the best. Hoping because you do not know what else to do. If you would take my advice, at least you... He cut her off, gesturing sharply with his pipe, with never a care for the glares the 2 women gave him. I do have a plan. If they wanted to know, let them know, and he would be burned if he changed a word. First, I mean to put an end to the wars and killing, whether I started them or not. If men have to kill, let them kill Trollocs, not each other. In the Aiel War, 4 clans crossed the Dragon Wall and had their way for better than 2 years. They looted and burned Cairhien, defeated every army sent against it. They could have taken Tar Valon had they wanted. The tower couldn't have stopped them because of your 3 oaths. Not to use the power as a weapon except against Shadowspawn or Dark Friends or in defense of their own lives. That was another of the oaths. And the Aiel had not threatened the tower itself. Anger had him in its grip now. Running and hoping, was he? 4 clans did that. What will happen when I lead 11 across the spine of the world? It would have to be 11. Small hope of bringing in the Shido. By the time the nations even think of uniting, it will be too late. They'll accept my peace, or I'll be buried in the Khan Briat. A discordant plunk rose from the harp, and a tail bent over the instrument, shaking his head. In a moment, the soothing sounds came again. A melon couldn't be swollen enough for your head, Egwene muttered, folding her arms beneath her breasts. And a stone couldn't be as stubborn. Moraine is only trying to help you. Why won't you see that? The Aes Sedai smoothed her silk skirts, though they did not need it. Taking the Aiel across the Dragon Wall might be the worst thing you could possibly do. There was an edge to her voice, anger or frustration. At least he was getting across to her that he was no puppet. By this time, the Amaran seat will be approaching the rulers of every nation that still has a ruler, laying the proofs before them that you are the Dragon Reborn. They know the prophecies. They know what you were born to do. Once they are convinced of who and what you are, they will accept you because they must. The last battle is coming, and you are their only hope. Humankind's only hope. Rand laughed out loud. It was a bitter laugh. Sticking his pipe between his teeth, he hoisted himself to sit cross-legged atop the table, staring at them. So you and Swan Sanche still think you know everything there is to know. The light willing, they did not know near everything about him, and would never find out. You're both fools. Show some respect, Egwene growled, but Rand went on over her words. The Tyrant High Lords know the prophecies too, and they knew me once they saw the sword that cannot be touched clutched in my fist. Half of them expect me to bring them power or glory or both. The other half would as soon slip a knife in my back and try to forget the Dragon Reborn was ever in Tyr. That is how the nations will greet the Dragon Reborn. Unless I quell them first, the same way I do the Titans. Do you know why I left Kalendor and Tyr? To remind them of me. Every day they know it is there, driven into the heart of the stone, and they know I'll come back for it. That is what holds them to me. That was one reason he had left the sword that is not a sword behind. He did not like even to think of the other. Be very careful, Moraine said after a moment. Just that, in a voice all frozen calm. He heard stark warning in the words. Once he had heard her say, in much the same tone, that she would see him dead before letting the shadow hit him. A hard woman. For a long moment she gazed at him, her eyes dark pools that threatened to swallow him. Then she made a perfect curtsy. By your leave, my Lord Dragon, I will see to letting Master Kadir know where I expect him to work tomorrow. No one could have seen or heard the faintest mockery in action or words, but Rand felt it. Anything that might put him off balance, make him more biddable by guilt or shame or uncertainty or whatever, she would try. He stared after her until the clicking beads in the doorway obscured her. There is no need you scowling like that, Randolph Thor. Egwene's voice was low, her eyes irate. She held onto her shawl as if she wanted to strangle him with it. Oh, dragon, indeed. Whatever you are, you're a rude, ill-mannered lout. You deserve more than you got. It would not kill you to be civil. So it was you, he snapped, but to his surprise, she half shook her head before catching herself. It had been Moraine after all. If the Aes Sedai was showing that much temper, something must be wearing at her terribly. Him, no doubt. Perhaps he should apologize. I suppose it wouldn't hurt to be civil. Though he could not see why he was supposed to be mannerly to the Aes Sedai while she tried to lead him on a leash. But if he was thinking of trying to be polite, Egwene was not. If glowing coals were dark brown, they would have been exactly like her eyes. You are a wool-headed fool, Randolph Thor, and I should never have told Elaine you were good enough for her. You aren't good enough for a weasel. Bring your nose down. I remember you sweating, trying to talk your way out of some trouble Matt had gotten you into. I can remember Nynaeve switching you till you howled, and you needing a cushion to sit on the rest of the day. Not that many years gone, either. I had to tell Elaine to forget you. If she knew half what you've turned into... He gaped at her as the tirade went on, with her more furious than at any time since first coming through the bead curtain. Then it hit him. That little near shake of her head that she had not meant to give, letting him know it had been Moraine who struck him with the power. Egwene worked very hard at doing what she was about in proper fashion. Studying with the wise ones, she wore Aiel clothes. She might even be trying to adopt Aiel customs for all he knew. It would be like her. But she worked hard at being a proper Aes Sedai all the time, even if she was only one of the accepted. Aes Sedai usually kept a rein on their tempers, but they never ever gave anything away that they wanted to hide. Ilyena never flashed her temper at me when she was angry with herself. When she gave me the rough side of her tongue, it was because she... His mind froze for an instant. He had never met a woman named Ilyena in his life. But he could summon up a face for the name dimly. A pretty face, skin like cream, golden hair exactly the shade of Elaine's. This had to be the madness. Remembering an imaginary woman. Perhaps one day he would find himself having conversations with people who were not there. Egwene's harangue shut off with a concerned look. Are you all right, Rand? The anger was gone from her voice, as if it had never been. Is something wrong? Should I fetch Moraine back to... No, he said, and just as quickly softened his own tone. She can't heal. Even an Aes Sedai could not heal madness. None of them could heal any of what ailed him. Is Elaine well? She is well. Despite what Egwene had said, there was a hint of sympathy in her voice. That was all he really expected. Beyond what he had known when Elaine left Tyr, what she was up to was an Aes Sedai concern and none of his. So Egwene had told him more than once, and Moraine echoed her. The three wise ones who could dream walk, those Egwene was studying with, had been even less informative. They had their own reasons not to be pleased with him. I had best to go too, Egwene went on, settling her shawl over her arms. You are tired. Frowning slightly, she said, Rand, what does it mean to be buried in Cambriat? He started to ask what under the light she was talking about. Then he remembered using that phrase. Just something I heard once, he lied. He had no more idea what it meant than where it had come from. You rest, Rand, she said, sounding 20 years older rather than 2 years younger. Promise me you will. You need it. He nodded. She studied his face for a moment as though searching for the truth, then started for the door. Rand's silver goblet of wine floated up from the carpet and drifted to him. He hastily snatched it out of the air just before Egwene looked back over her shoulder.
Right back, everyone.
Perhaps I shouldn't tell you this, she said. Elaine didn't give it to me as a message. She said she loves you. Perhaps you know already, but if you don't, you should think about it. With that, she was gone, the beads clicking together behind her. Leaping from the table, Rand hurled the goblet away, splashing wine across the floor tiles as he rounded on Jason Natale in a fury. Chapter 3. Pale Shadows. Seizing Saidin, Rand channeled, wove flows of air that snatched Natale up from the cushions. The gilded harp tumbled to the dark red tiles as the man was pinned against the wall, immobile from neck to ankles, and his feet half a pace above the floor. I've warned you. Never channel when anyone else is around. Never! Natale tilted his head in that peculiar way he had, as if trying to look at Rand sideways or watch without being noticed. If she had seen, she would have thought it was you. There was no apology in his voice, no diffidence, but no challenge either. He seemed to think he was offering a reasonable explanation. Besides, you look thirsty. A court bard should look after his lord's needs. That was one of the small conceits he surrounded himself with. If Rand was the Lord Dragon, then he himself must be a court bard, not a simple gleeman. Feeling disgusted with himself, as much as angry at the man, Rand unraveled the weave and let him drop. Manhandling him was like picking a fight with a boy of 10. He could not see the shield that constricted the other man's access to Saidin. It was female work, but he knew it was there. Moving a goblet was about the extent of Natale's ability now. Luckily, the shield had been hidden from female eyes, too. Natale called the trick inverting. He did not seem able to explain it, though. And if she'd seen my face and was suspicious, I was as startled as if that goblet had flown at me by itself. He stuck his pipe back between his teeth and sent up furious streams of smoke. She still wouldn't suspect. Settling back onto the cushions, the other man took up the harp again, strumming a line of music that had a devious sound. How could anyone suspect? I do not entirely believe the situation myself. If there was even a touch of bitterness in his voice, Rand could not detect it. He was not entirely sure he believed it either, though he had worked hard enough for it. The man in front of him, Jason Natale, had another name, Osmodian. Idly playing the harp, Osmodian did not look like one of the dreaded Forsaken. He was even moderately handsome. Rand supposed he would be attractive to women. It often seemed strange that evil had left no outward mark. He was one of the Forsaken, and far from trying to kill him, Rand hid what he was from Moraine and everyone else. He needed a teacher. If what was true for the women Aes Sedai called Wilders also held for men, he had only one chance in 4 of surviving the attempt to learn to use the power on his own. That was discounting the madness. His teacher had to be a man. Moraine and others had told him often enough that a bird could not teach a fish to fly, nor a fish a bird to swim. And his teacher had to be someone experienced, someone who already knew all the things he needed to learn. With Aes Sedai channeling men who could channel as soon as they were found, and fewer were found every year, that left small choices. A man who had simply discovered he could channel would know no more than he did. A false dragon who could channel, if Rand could find one, not already caught and gentled, would not be likely to give up his own dreams of glory for another claiming to be the dragon reborn. What remained, what Rand had lured to him, was one of the Forsaken. Asmodean plucked random chords as Rand took a seat on a cushion facing him. It was well to remember that the man had not changed, not inside, from the day so long ago when he had pledged his soul to the shadow. What he did now, he did under duress. He had not come to the light. Do you ever think of turning back, Mateo? He was always careful of the name. One breath of Asmodean, and Moraine would be sure he had gone over to the shadow. Moraine, and maybe others. Neither he nor Asmodean might survive that. The man's hands froze in the strings, his face utterly blank. Turn back. Demandred, Robin, any of them would kill me on sight now. If I was lucky. Except Lanfear, perhaps. And you will understand if I don't want to put her to the test. Semirhage could make a boulder beg for mercy and thank her for death. And as for the Great Lord, the Dark One, Rand broke in sharply around his pipe stem. The Great Lord of the Dark was what Dark Friends called the Dark One. Dark Friends and the Forsaken. Asmodean bowed his head briefly in acquiescence. When the Dark One breaks free. If his face had been expressionless before, now it was bleak in every line. Suffice it to say that I will find Semirhage and give myself to her before I'll face the Dark One's punishment for betrayal. As well you are here to teach me, then. Mournful music began to flow from the harp, speaking of loss and tears. The March of Death, Asmodean said over the music. The final movement of the Grand Passions cycle, composed some 300 years before the War of Power by... Rand cut him off. You are not teaching me very well. As well as may be expected under the circumstances. You can grasp Saidin every time you try now, and tell one flow from another. You can shield yourself, and the power does what you want it to. He stopped playing and frowned, not looking at Rand. Do you think Lanfear really intended me to teach you everything? If she had wanted that, she would have contrived to stay close, so she could link us. She wants you to live, Lews Therin. But this time she means to be stronger than you. Don't call me that, Rand snapped, but Asmodean did not seem to hear. If you planned this between you, trapping me... Rand sensed a surge in Asmodean, as if the Forsaken were testing the shield Lanfear had woven around him. Women who could channel saw a glow surrounding another woman who had embraced Thaidar, and felt her channeling clearly. But he never saw anything around Asmodean, and felt little. If you worked it out together, then you let her outfox you on more levels than one. I've told you I am not a very good teacher, especially without a link. You did plan it between you, didn't you? He did look at Rand then, sidelong but still intent. How much do you remember? Of being Lews Therin, I mean. She said you recalled nothing at all, but she could lie to the Dark One himself. This time she spoke the truth. Seating himself on one of the cushions, Rand channeled one of the clan chief's untouched silver goblets to him. Even such a brief touch of Saidin was exhilarating and fouling, and hard to release. He did not want to talk about Lews Therin. He was tired of people thinking he was Lews Therin. The bowl of his pipe had grown hot with all the puffing, so he held it by the stem and gestured with it. If linking will help you teach me, why don't we link? Osmodian looked at him as if he had asked why they did not eat rocks, then shook his head. I continually forget how much you don't know. You and I cannot. Not without a woman to join us. You could ask Moraine, I suppose, or the girl Egwene. One of them might be able to reason out the method, so long as you don't mind them finding out who I am. Don't lie to me, Mateo, Rand growled. Well before meeting the tale, he had learned that a man's channeling and a woman's were as different as men and women themselves. But he took little the man said on trust. I've heard Egwene and others talk about Aes Sedai linking their powers. If they can do it, why not you and I? Because we can't. Exasperation filled Osmodian's tone. Ask a philosopher if you want to know why. Why can't dogs fly? Perhaps in the grand scheme of the pattern, it's a balance for men being stronger. We cannot link without them, but they can without us. Up to 13 of them can anyway. A small mercy. After that, they need men to make the circle larger. Rand was sure he had caught a lie this time. Moraine said that in the Age of Legends, men and women had been equally strong in the power, and she could not lie. He said as much, adding, the 5 powers are equal. Earth, fire, air, water, and spirit. The tale strummed a chord for each. They are equal, true, and it is also true that what a man can do with one, a woman can also. In kind, at least. But that has nothing to do with men being stronger. What Moraine believes to be true, she tells as truth, whether or not it is. One of 1,000 weaknesses in those fool oaths. He played a bit of something that did indeed sound foolish. Some women have stronger arms than some men, but in general, it is the other way around. The same holds with strength in the power, and in about the same proportion.
Give me 1 second, everyone.
Rand nodded slowly.
I'm still here. I'm
It
just
did make a kind of
eating
sense.
some toast.
Elaine and Egwene were considered 2 of the strongest women to train in the tower for 1,000 years or more. But he had tested himself against them once, and later Elaine had confessed that she felt like a kitten seized by a mastiff. Osmodian was not finished. If 2 women link, they do not double their strength. Linking is not as simple as adding together the power of each. But if they are strong enough, they can match a man. And when they take the circle to 13, then you must be wary. 13 women who can barely channel could overpower most men, linked. The 13 weakest women in the tower could overpower you or any man, and barely breathe hard. I came across a saying in Ara Daman. The more women there are about, the softer a wise man steps. It would not be bad to remember it. Rand shivered, thinking of a time when he had been among more than 13 Aes Sedai. Of course, most of them had not known who he was. If they had, if Egwene and Moraine linked. He did not want to believe Egwene had gone that far toward the tower and away from their friendship. Whatever she does with her whole heart, and she's becoming Aes Sedai. So is Elaine. Swallowing half his wine did not completely wash the thought away. What more can you tell me about the Forsaken? It was a question he was sure he had asked 100 times, but he always hoped there was a scrap more to dig out. Better than thinking about Moraine and Egwene linking to. I have told you everything I know. Osmodian sighed heavily. We are hardly close friends at the best. Do you believe I'm holding back something? I don't know where the others are, if that is what you want. Except Samael. And you knew he'd taken Ilion for his kingdom before I told you. Grendal was in Ara Daman for a time, but I expect she is gone now. She likes her comforts too well. I suspect Moghedien is or was in the west somewhere as well. But no one ever finds the spider unless she wants to be found. Ravin has a queen for one of his pets, but your guess is as good as mine as to what country she rules for him. And that is all I know that might help locate them. Rand had heard all that before. It seemed he had heard all Osmodian had to say at the Forsaken 50 times already. so often that at moments it seemed he had always known what the man was telling him. Some of it he almost wished he had never learned, what Semirag found amusing, for instance, and some made no sense. Demandred had gone over to the Shadow because he envied Luz Theron Telamon. Rand could not imagine envying someone enough to do anything because of it, and surely not that. As claimed it had been the thought of immortality, of endless ages of music that seduced him. He claimed to have been a noted composer of music before. Senseless. Yet in that mass of often blood-chilling knowledge might lie keys to surviving Tarmangeddon. Whatever he'd told Moraine, he knew he would have to face them then, if not before. Emptying the goblet, he set it on the floor tiles. Wine would not wash out facts. The bead curtain rattled, and he looked over his shoulder as Gashine entered, white-robed and silent. While some began gathering up the food and drink that had been laid out for him and the chiefs, another, a man, carried a large silver tray to the table. On it were covered dishes, a silver cup, and 2 large green-striped pottery pitchers. One would hold wine, the other water. A Gashine woman brought in a gilded lamp already lit and set it beside the tray. Through the windows, the sky was beginning to take on the yellow red of sunset. In the brief time between baking and freezing, the air actually felt comfortable. Rand stood as the Gashine departed, but did not follow immediately. "What do you think of my chances in the last battle, Nateo?" Asmodean hesitated in pulling red and blue striped wool blankets from behind his cushions and looked up at him, head tilted in that sideways manner of his. "You found something in the square the day we met here." "Forget that," Rand said harshly. "There had been 2, not 1. I destroyed it in any case." He thought Asmodean's shoulders slumped a trifle. "Then the Dark One will consume you alive. As for me, I intend to open my veins the hour I know he is free, if I get the chance. A quick death is better than what I'll find elsewhere." He tossed the blankets aside and sat staring glumly at nothing. "Better than going mad, certainly. I'm as subject to that as you now. You broke the bond that protected me." There was no bitterness in his voice, only hopelessness. "What if there was another way to shield against the taint?" Rand demanded. "What if it could be removed somehow? Would you kill yourself then?" Asmodean's barked laugh was utterly acid. "The Shadow take me, you must be beginning to think you really are the bloody creator. We are dead, both of us. Are you too blind with pride to see it? Or just too thick-witted, you hopeless shepherd?" Rand refused to be drawn. "Then why not go ahead and end it?" he asked in a tight voice. "I wasn't too blind to see what you and Lanfear were up to. I wasn't too thick-witted to fool her and trap you. If there's no hope, no chance, not the smallest shred, then why are you still alive?" Still not looking at him, Asmodean rubbed the side of his nose. "I once saw a man hanging from a cliff," he said slowly. "The brink was crumbling under his fingers, and the only thing near enough to grasp was a tuft of grass, a few long blades with roots barely clinging to the rock. The only chance he had of climbing back up on the cliff. So he grabbed it." His abrupt chuckle held no mirth. He had known it would pull free. "Did you save him?" Rand asked. But Asmodean did not answer. As Rand started for the doorway, the sounds of the March of Death began again behind him. The strings of beads fell together behind him, and the 5 maidens who had been waiting in the wide, empty hall flowed easily to their feet from where they had been squatting on the pale blue tiles. They were all but one tall for women, though not for Aiel women. Their leader, Adeline, lacked little more than a hand of being able to look him in the eyes. The exception, a fiery redhead named Denilah, was no taller than Egwene, and extremely touchy about being so short. Like the clan chiefs, their eyes were all blue or gray or green, and their hair, light brown or yellow or red, was cut short except for a tail at the nape of the neck. Full quivers balanced the long-bladed knives at their belts, and they wore cased horn bows on their backs. Each carried 3 or 4 short, long-bladed spears and a round bull-hide buckler. Aiel women who did not want hearth and children had their own warrior society, Farderais Mai, the Maidens of the Spear. He acknowledged them with a small bow, which made them smile. It was not an Aiel custom, at least not the way he had been taught to do it. "I see you, Adeline," he said. "Where is Joinda? I thought she was with you earlier. Has she taken ill?" "I see you, Randalthor," she replied. Her pale yellow hair seemed paler, framing her sun-dark face, which had a fine white scar across one cheek. "In a way, she has. She has been talking to herself all day, and not an hour ago she went off to lay a bridal wreath at the feet of Garan, of the Jirat Goshin." Some of the others shook their heads. Marrying meant giving up the spear. "Tomorrow is his last day as her Gaishain. Joinda is Blackrock Sharad," she added significantly. It was significant. Marriages came frequently with men and women taking Gaishain, but very seldom between clans with blood feud, even blood feud in abeyance. "It is an illness that spreads," Anila said heatedly. Her voice was usually as hot as her hair. "1 or 2 maidens make their bridal wreaths every day since we came to Rudian." Rand nodded with what he hoped they took for sympathy. It was his fault. If they told him, he wondered how many would still risk staying near him. All, probably. Honor would hold them, and they had no more fear than the clan chiefs. At least it was only marriages so far. Even maidens would think marrying better than what some had experienced. Maybe they would. "I will be ready to go in a moment," he told them. "We will wait with patience," Adeline said. It hardly seemed patience. Standing there, they all appeared poised on the edge of sudden movement. It really did take him only a moment to do what he wanted: weave flows of spirit and fire into a box around the room and tie them so the weave held on its own. Anyone could go in or out, except a man who could channel. For himself, or Asmodean, walking through that doorway would be like walking through a wall of solid flame. He had discovered the weave, and that Asmodean, blocked, was too weak to channel through it, by accident. No one was likely to question the doings of a gleeman, but if someone did, Jason Natel had simply chosen to sleep as far from Aiel as he could manage in Rudian. That was a choice that Adnan Kadir's drivers and guards, at least, could sympathize with. And this way, Rand knew exactly where the man was of a night. The maidens asked him no questions. He turned away. The maidens followed him, spread out and wary as if they expected an attack right there. Asmodean was still playing the lament. Arms outstretched to either side, Matt Coffin walked the wide, white coping of the dry fountain, singing to the men who watched him in the fading light. "We'll drink the wine till the cup is dry, and kiss the girls so they'll not cry, and toss the dice until we fly to dance with Jack of the Shadows." The air felt cool after the day's heat, and he thought briefly of buttoning up his fine green silk coat with the golden embroidery, but the drink the Aiel called Usquai had put a buzz in his head like giant flies, and the thought flittered away. The white stone figures of 3 women stood on a platform in the dusty basin, 20 feet tall and unclothed. Each had been made with one hand upraised, the other holding a huge stone jar tilted over her shoulder for water to pour from. But one was missing her head and upraised hand, and on another the jar was a shattered ruin. "We'll dance all night while the moon runs free, and dandle the lasses upon our knee, and then you'll ride along with me to dance with Jack of the Shadows." A fine song to be singing about death, one of the wagon drivers shouted in a heavy Lugarder accent. Kadir's men kept themselves in a tight knot apart from the Aielmen around the fountain. They were all tough, hard-faced men, but every one was sure any Aiel would slit his throat for a wrong glance. They were not far wrong. I heard my old grandmother talk about Jack of the Shadows, the big-eared Lugarder went on. 'Tisn't right to sing about death that way. Matt Musley considered the song he had been singing and grimaced. No one had heard Dance with Jack of the Shadows since Aldershot fell. In his head, he could still hear the defiant song rising as the Golden Lions launched their last futile charge at Arthur Hawkwing's encircling army. At least he had not been babbling it in the old tongue. He was not as juicy as he looked by half, but there had indeed been too many cups of Usquai. The stuff looked and tasted like brown water, but it hit your head like a mule's kick. Moraine will pack me off to the tower yet if I'm not careful. At least it would get me out of the waste and away from Rand. Maybe he was drunker than he thought, if he considered that a fair trade. He shifted to Tinker in the kitchen. Tinker in the kitchen, with a job of work to do, mistress up above, slipping on a robe of blue. She dances down the staircase, her fancy all so free, crying, Tinker, oh dear Tinker, won't you mend the pot for me? Some of Kadir's men joined in the song as he danced back to where he had begun. The Aiel did not. Among them, men did not sing except for battle chants or laments for the slain. And neither did maidens, except among themselves. 2 Aiel men were squatting on the coping, showing none of the effects of the Usquai they had consumed, unless their eyes were the faintest bit glassy. He would be glad to get back where light-colored eyes were a rarity. Growing up, he had not seen anything but brown or black, except on Rand. A few pieces of wood, worm-holed arms and legs from chairs, lay on the broad paving stones in the area left open by the watchers. An empty red pottery crock lay beside the coping, as did another that still held Usquai, and a silver cup. The game was to take a drink, then try to hit a target thrown into the air with a knife. None of Kadir's men and few of the Aiel would dice with him, not when he won as often as he did. And they did not play at cards. Knife throwing was supposed to be different, especially with Usquai added in. He had not won as often as he did with dice, but half a dozen worked gold cups and 2 bowls lay inside the basin beneath him, along with bracelets and necklaces set with rubies or moonstones or sapphires, and a scattering of coins as well. His flat-crowned hat and an odd spear with a black haft rested beside his winnings. Some of it was even Aiel made. They were more likely to pay for something with a piece of loot than with a coin. Corman, one of the Aiel on the coping, looked up at him as he cut off singing. A white scar slanted across his nose. You are nearly as good with knives as you are with dice, Matrim Coffin. Shall we call it an end? The light is failing. There's plenty of light. Matt squinted at the sky. Pale shadows covered everything here in the valley of Rudian, but the sky was still light enough to see against, at least. My grandmother could make the throw in this. I can make it blindfolded. Genric, the other squatting Aiel, peered around the onlookers. Are there women here? Built like a bear, he considered himself a wit. The only time a man talks like that is when there are women to impress. The maidens scattered through the crowd laughed as hard as anyone else, and maybe harder. You think I can't? Matt muttered, ripping off the dark scarf he wore around his neck to hide the scar where he had once been hung. Just shout now when you throw it up, Corman. Hastily, he tied the scarf around his eyes and drew one of his knives from his sleeve. The loudest sound was the watcher's breathing. Not drunk, and juicier than a fiddler's whelp. And yet he suddenly felt his luck, felt that surge the way he did when he knew which spots would show before the dice stopped tumbling. It seemed to clear his head a little. Throw it, he murmured calmly. Now, Corman called, and Matt's arm whipped back, then forward. In the stillness, the thunk of steel stabbing wood was as loud as the clatter of the target on the pavement. No one said a word as he pulled the scarf back down around his neck. A piece of a chair arm, no bigger than his hand, lay in the open space, his blade stuck firmly in the middle. Corman had tried to shave the odds, it appeared. Well, he had never specified the target. He suddenly realized he had not even made a wager. Finally, one of Kadir's men half shouted, "A dark one's own luck, that." Luck is a horse to ride like any other, Matt said to himself, no matter where it came from. Not that he knew where his luck came from. He only tried to ride it as best he could. As quietly as he had spoken, Jenrick frowned up at him. "What was that you said, Matrim Cawthon?" Matt opened his mouth to repeat himself, then closed it again as the words came clear in his mind. "Senesovia Kabadonde, Ain Dovinia." The old tongue. "Nothing," he muttered. "Just talking to myself." The onlookers were beginning to drift away. "I guess the light really is fading too much to go on." Corman put a foot on the piece of wood to wrench Matt's knife free and brought it back to him. "Sometime again, maybe, Matrim Cawthon. Someday." That was the Aiel way of saying never, when they did not want to say it right out. Matt nodded as he slipped the blade back into one of the sheaths inside his sleeve. It was the same as the time he had rolled 6 sixes 23 times in a row. He could hardly blame them. Being lucky was not all it was made out. He noted with a bit of envy that neither Aiel staggered in the slightest as they joined the departing crowd. Scrubbing a hand through his hair, Matt sat down heavily on the coping. The memories that had once cluttered his head like raisins in a cake now blended with his own. In one part of his mind, he knew he had been born in the Two Rivers 20 years before. But he could remember clearly leading the flanking attack that turned the Trollocs at Maganda, and dancing in the court of Tarmanduin, and 100 other things. 1,000. Mostly battles. He remembered dying more times than he wanted to think of. No seams between lives anymore. He could not tell his memories from the others unless he concentrated. Reaching behind him, he set his wide-brimmed hat on his head and fished the odd spear across his knees. Instead of an ordinary spearhead, it had what looked like a 2-foot sword blade, marked with a pair of ravens. Lance said that blade had been made during the War of the Shadow, the War of the Power. The warder claimed it would never need sharpening and never break. Matt thought he would not trust that unless he had to. It might have lasted 3,000 years, but he had little trust of the power. Cursive script ran along the black hat, punctuated at either end with another raven, inlaid in some metal even darker than the wood. In the old tongue, but he could read it now, of course. "Thus is our treaty written. Thus is agreement made. Thought is the arrow of time. Memory never fades. What was asked is given. The price is paid." One way down the wide street, half a mile off, was a square that would have been called large in most cities. The Aiel traders were gone for the night, but their pavilions still stood, made of the same grayish-brown wool used for Aiel tents. Hundreds of traders had come to Rudion from every part of the waste for the biggest fair the Aiel had ever seen, and more arrived every day. The traders had been among the first to actually start living in the city. Matt did not really want to look the other way, toward the great plaza. He could make out the shapes of Kadir's wagons, awaiting more loading tomorrow. What appeared to be a twisted redstone door frame had been heaved into one that afternoon. Moraine had taken particular care to see it lashed firmly in place, just as she wanted. He did not know what she knew of it, and he was not about to ask. Better if she forgot he was alive, no small chance of that. But whatever she knew, he was sure he knew more. He had stepped through it, a fool looking for answers. What he had gotten instead was a head full of other men's memories. That and dead. He tucked the scarf closer around his neck. And 2 other things. A silver fox-head medallion that he wore under his shirt, and the weapon across his knees. Small recompense. He ran his fingers lightly down the script. Memory never fades. They had a sense of humor fit for Aiel, those folk on the other side of that doorway. Can you do that every time? He jerked his head around to stare at the maiden who had just sat down beside him. Tall, even for an Aiel, maybe taller than he was. She had hair like spun gold and eyes the color of a clear morning sky. She was older than he, maybe by 10 years, but that had never put him off. Then again, she was Farder Mai. I am Melindra, she went on, of the Jumai sept. Can you do that every time? She meant the knife throwing, he realized. She gave her sept, but no clan. Aiel never did that, unless... She had to be one of the Shido maidens who had come to join Rand. He did not really understand all this about societies, but as for Shido, he remembered them trying to stick spears in him too well. Couladin did not like anyone associated with Rand, and what Couladin hated, the Shido hated. On the other hand, Melindra had come here to Rudion, a maiden. But she wore a small smile. Her gaze held an inviting light. Most of the time, he said truthfully. Even when he did not feel it, his luck was good. When he did, it was perfect. She chuckled, her smile widening, as if she thought he was boasting. Women seemed to make up their minds whether you were lying without looking at the evidence. On the other hand, if they liked you, they either did not care or else decided even the most outrageous lie was true. Maidens could be dangerous, whatever their clan. Any woman could. He had learned that on his own. But Melindra's eyes were definitely not just looking at him. Dipping into his winnings, he pulled up a necklace of gold spirals, each centered on a deep blue sapphire, the largest as big as the joint of his thumb. He could remember a time, his own memory, when the smallest of those stones would have made him sweat. They'll look pretty with your eyes, he said, laying the heavy strand in her hands. He had never seen a maiden wear baubles of any sort, but in his experience, every woman liked jewelry. Strangely, they liked flowers nearly as well. He did not understand it, but then he was willing to admit that he understood women less than he did his luck, or what had happened on the other side of that twisted doorway. Very fine work, she said, holding it up. I accept your offer. The necklace disappeared into her belt pouch, and she leaned over to push his hat back on his head. Your eyes are pretty, like dark polished cat's eye. She twisted around to pull her feet up onto the coping, and sat with her arms wrapped around her knees. My dear sisters have told me about it. Mac pulled his hat back into place and watched her warily from under the head. What had they told her? And what offer? The irritation was gone from her eyes. She looked like a cat studying a mouse. That was the trouble with maidens. Sometimes it was hard to tell whether they wanted to dance with you, kiss you, or kill you. The street was emptying, the shadows deepening, but he recognized Rand slanting across down the road, pipe clenched between his teeth. He was the only man in Rudion likely to be walking with a fistful of Farder Mai. Guarded she-wolves, leaping to do whatever he says. Some men might have envied him that much, at least. Not Matt. Not most of the time. If it had been a pack of girls like Essendra, no. Excuse me for a moment, Essendra, hurriedly. Leaning his spear against the low wall around the fountain, he leaped up, already running. His head still buzzed, but not so loudly as before, and he did not stagger. He had no worries about his winnings. The Aiel had very definite views of what was allowed. Taking in a raid was one thing, theft another. Kadir's men had learned to keep their hands in their pockets after one of them had been caught stealing. After a beating that left him striped from shoulders to heels, he had been sent away. The one water bag he had been allowed would not have been nearly enough for him to reach the dragon wall, even if he had had any clothes on. Now Kadir's men would not pick up a copper they found lying in the street. Rand walked on with his encircling escort. Rand! Rand was not even 10 paces away, but he did not waver. Some of the maidens looked back, but not Rand. Matt felt cold suddenly, and it had nothing to do with the onset of night. He wet his lips and spoke again, not a shout. Lews Theron! And Rand turned around. Matt almost wished he had not. For a time they only looked at one another in the twilight. Matt hesitated about going closer. He tried telling himself it was because of the maidens. Adeline had been one of those who taught him a so-called game Maiden's Kiss that he was never likely to forget, or play again if he had any say in it. And he could feel Anila's gaze like an auger boring into his skull. Who would have expected a woman to go up like oil thrown on a fire just because you told her she was the prettiest little flower you had ever seen? Rand now. He and Rand had grown up together. They and Perrin, the blacksmith's apprentice back in Emmons Field, had hunted together, fished together, tramped through the sandhills to the edge of the mountains of mist, camped under the stars. Rand was his friend. Only now he was the kind of friend who might bash your head in without meaning to. Perrin could be dead because of Rand. He made himself walk to arm's reach of the other man. Rand was nearly a head taller, and in the early evening gloom, he seemed taller yet, colder than he had been. I've been thinking, Rand. Matt wished he did not sound hoarse. He hoped Rand would answer to his right name this time. I've been away from home a long time. We both have, Rand said softly. A long time. Suddenly he gave a laugh, not loud, but almost like the old Rand. Are you beginning to miss milking your father's cows? Matt scratched his ear, grinning a bit. Not that, exactly. If he never saw the inside of another barn, it would be too soon. But I was thinking that when Kadir's wagons go, I might go with them. Rand was silent. When he spoke again, the brief flash of mirth was gone. All the way to Tarvalon? It was Matt's turn to hesitate. He wouldn't give me away to Moraine, would he? Maybe, he said casually. I don't know. That's where Moraine will want me. Maybe I'll find a chance to get back to the Two Rivers. See if everything's all right at home. See if Perrin's alive. See if my sisters are, and Mother, and Da. We all have to do what we must, Matt. Not what we want to, very often. What we must. It sounded like an excuse to Matt, as if Rand was asking him to understand. Only he had done what he had to himself a few times. I can't blame Perrin on him, not by himself. Nobody bloody forced me to follow after Rand like some bloody heel hound. Only that was not true either. He had been forced. Just not by Rand. Stop me leaving? I don't try to tell you to come or go, Matt, Rand said wearily. The wheel weaves the pattern, not me. And the wheel weaves as the wheel wills. For all the world like a bloody Aes Sedai. Half turning to go, Rand added, Don't trust Kadir, Matt. In some ways, he's about as dangerous a man as you ever met. Don't trust him an inch, or you might get your throat slit. And you and I wouldn't be the only ones to regret that. Then he was gone, down the street in the deepening dusk, with the maidens around him like slinking wolves. Matt stared after him. Trust the merchant? I wouldn't trust Kadir if he was tied in a sack. So Rand did not weave the pattern. He came close. Before ever any of them learned that the prophecies had anything to do with them, they had learned that Rand was ta'veren, one of those rare individuals who, instead of being woven willy-nilly into the pattern, instead forced the pattern to shape itself around them. Matt knew about being ta'veren. He was one himself, though not as strong as Rand. Sometimes Rand could affect people's lives, change the course of them, just by being in the same town. Perrin was ta'veren as well, or maybe had been. Moraine had thought it was significant finding 3 young men who grew up in the same village, all destined to be ta'veren. She meant to fit them all into her plans, whatever they were. It was supposed to be a grand thing. All the ta'veren Matt had been able to learn about had been men like Arthur Hawkwing, or women like Mabriam and Sharid, whose stories had said founded the Compact of the 10 Nations after the breaking. But none of the stories told what happened when one ta'veren was close to another as strong as Rand. It was like being a leaf in a whirlpool. Melindra stopped beside him and handed him his spear and a heavy, coarse-woven sack that clinked. "I put your winnings in this for you." She was taller than he was, by a good 2 inches. She glanced after Rand. "I heard you were near brother to Rand al'Thor." "In a manner of speaking," he said dryly. "It does not matter," she said dismissively, and concentrated her gaze on him, fists on her hips. "You attracted my interest, Matt Coffin, before you gave me a regard gift. Not that I will give up the spear for you, of course, but I have had my eye on you for days. You have a smile like a boy about to do mischief. I like that. And those eyes." In the failing light, her grin was slow and wide and warm. "I do like your eyes." Matt tugged his hat straight, though it had not been crooked. From pursuer to pursued in the blink of an eye. It could happen like that with Aiel women, especially maidens. "Does Daughter of the 9 Moons mean anything to you?" It was a question he asked women sometimes. The wrong answer would send him out of Rudion tonight if he had to try walking out of the waste. "Nothing," she said. "But there are things I'd like to do by moonlight." Putting an arm around his shoulder, she took off his hat and began to whisper in his ear. In no time at all, he was grinning even more widely than she. Chapter 4. Twilight. With his Farderais Mai escort, Rand approached the Rudion roof of the Maidens. White stairs, as wide as the tall building, each step a stride deep, ran up to thick columns 20 paces high, black seeming in the twilight, but bright blue by day, and fluted in spirals. The outside of the building was a patterned mosaic of glazed tiles, white and blue in spirals, that appeared endless to the eye, and a huge window of colored glass directly above the columns showed a black-haired woman 15 feet tall, in complicated blue robes, right hand upraised, either to bless or command a halt. Her face was serene and stern at the same time. Whoever she had been, she was surely no Aiel, not with that pale skin and those dark eyes. An Aes Sedai, perhaps. He tapped his pipe out on his boot heel and stuffed it into his coat pocket before starting up the steps. Except for Gaishain, men were not allowed beneath the roof of the Maidens. Not any man, not in any hold in the waste. A chief or a maiden's bloodkin could die trying, though in fact no Aielman would ever think of it. It was the same for any society. Only members and the Gaishain were allowed inside. The 2 maidens standing guard at the tall bronze doors flashed maiden hand talk at one another, cutting their eyes in his direction as he came through the columns, then shared a small grin. He wished he knew what they had said. Even in as dry a land as the waste, bronze would tarnish with enough time, but Gaishain had polished these doors until they looked new-made. They stood wide open, and the pair of guards made no move to hinder him as he walked through, Adolin and the others on his heels. The wide, white-tiled corridors and great rooms inside were full of maidens sitting about on bright cushions, talking, tending to weapons, playing cat's cradle or stones or 1,000 flowers, an Aiel game that involved laying out patterns of flat bits of stone carved with what seemed 100 different symbols. Of course, a profusion of Gaishain moved smoothly about their chores, cleaning, serving, mending, seeing to oil lamps that ranged from simple glazed pottery to gilded loot from somewhere to the tall stand lamps that had been found in the city. In most rooms, colorful carpets and bright tapestries covered the floors and walls in nearly as many patterns and styles as there were carpets and tapestries. The walls and ceilings themselves were detailed mosaics of forests and rivers and skies that had never been seen in the waste. Young or old, the maidens smiled when they saw him, and some nodded familiarly, or even patted his shoulder. Others called out, asking how he was, had he eaten, would he like the Gaishain to bring him wine or water. He responded briefly, though with answering smiles. He was well, and neither thirsty or hungry. He kept walking, not even slowing when he spoke. Slowing would lead inevitably to stopping, and he was not up to that tonight. Father Mai had adopted him, after a fashion. Some treated him as a son, others as a brother. Age seemed not to come into it. Women with white in their hair might talk to him as a brother over tea, while maidens no more than a year older than he tried to make sure he wore the proper clothes for the heat. There was no avoiding the mothering. They simply did it, and he could not see how to make them stop, short of using the power against the whole lot of them. He had thought of trying to have another society provide his guards, Cheyenne and Thal, the Stone Dogs perhaps, or Ethan Dor, the Red Shields. Ruark had been a Red Shield before becoming chief. Only what reason could he possibly give? Not the truth, certainly. Just thinking about explaining that to Ruark and the others made him uncomfortable. Aiel humor being what it was, even sour old Han would likely break his ribs laughing. Any reason at all would probably offend the honor of every last maiden. At least they rarely mothered him except under the roof, where there was no one to see but themselves, and Gaishain, who knew better than to speak of anything that happened there. The maidens, he had once said, carry my honor. Everyone remembered that, and the maidens were as proud of it as if he had given them all thrones. But it had turned out that they carried it in a manner they chose. Adeline and the other four left him to join their friends, but he was hardly alone as he climbed higher in the building, along curving flights of wide white stairs. He had to answer the same questions at practically every step. No, he was not hungry. Yes, he knew he was not used to the heat yet, and no, he had not spent too much time in the sun. He bore it all patiently, but he did heave a sigh of relief when he reached the second story above the huge window. Here, there were no maidens and no Gaishain in the broad hallways, or on the stairs that led on upward. The bare walls and empty chambers emphasized the absence of people. But after traversing the floors below, he found solitude a blessing. His bedroom was a windowless chamber near the center of the building, one of the few that was not huge, though its ceiling still reached high enough to make height the room's longest dimension. What it had been meant for originally, he had no idea. A mosaic of vines around the small fireplace was the only ornamentation. A servant's room, he would have said, but servants' rooms did not have a door sheathed in bronze, however plain, that he pushed most of the way shut. Gaishain had polished the metal to a dull gleam. A few tasseled cushions lay scattered on the blue floor tiles for sitting, and a thick pallet atop bright layered rugs for sleeping. A simple blue-glazed pitcher of water and a dark green cup sat on the floor near the bed. That was it, except for 2 3-pronged stand lamps, already lit, and a pace-high pile of books in one corner. With a tired sigh, he lay down on the pallet, still in his coat and boots. No matter how he shifted, it was not much softer than sleeping on the bare floor. The night's chill was already seeping into the room, but he did not bother to light the dried cow dung on the hearth. He was readier to face the cold than the smell. Asmodean had tried to show him a simple way to keep the room warm. Simple, but something the man did not have enough strength to do himself. The one time Rand had tried it, he had awakened in the middle of the night, gasping for breath, while the edges of the rugs smoldered from the heat of the floor. He had not made another attempt. He had chosen this building for his quarters because it was whole and near to the plaza. Its great high ceilings gave a semblance of coolness, even to the hottest part of the day, and its thick walls kept out the worst of the cold at night. It had not been the roof of the maidens then, of course. One morning he simply awakened to find it so. Maidens in every room on the first 2 floors, and their guards on the doors. It had taken him a while to realize that they intended the building for their society's roof in Rudian, yet expected him to continue to stay in it. In fact, they were ready to move the roof wherever he went. That was why he had to meet the clan chiefs elsewhere. The best he had been able to manage was to make the maidens agree to stay below the floor where he slept. That had amused them all no end. Even the Karn is not a king, he reminded himself wryly. Twice already he had moved upward as the numbers of maidens increased. Idly, he tried to calculate how many more could come in before he was sleeping on the roof. That was better than remembering how he had let Moraine get under his skin. He had not meant her to learn his plans until the day the Aiel moved. She knew exactly how to manipulate his emotions, how to make him so angry that he said more than he wanted to.
All right, everyone. I'm going to call into this live for tonight. But I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all support. Until next time, everyone, y'all stay safe.